Johnia Berry was born on October 26, 1983, in the small American town of Bristol, Tennessee. She was lively and sociable, had many friends, and was always the life of the party. During her school years, she was also part of the local cheerleading team. After high school, Johnia enrolled at East Tennessee State University, where she studied psychology and criminalistics. While studying, she also worked part-time at a children's educational center. During her time at university, she met a guy named Jason White. They dated for several years, and shortly before graduation, they got engaged. In late 2004, when Johnia was 21 years old, she decided to pursue a master's degree in psychology, which required her to temporarily move to Knoxville to study at a different university. After working at the Children's Center, she realized her passion for this field and aspired to become a child psychologist. Meanwhile, her boyfriend continued his studies in another state, aiming to obtain a law degree. Despite the distance, the couple communicated every day and started preparing for their wedding, which was only a few months away. In Knoxville, Johnia planned to find her own accommodation, but for the first few weeks, she stayed at her friend Jason Amami's apartment. He had studied with her and her boyfriend at the university, and after graduating, he moved to Knoxville. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and agreed to host his friend until she found a place of her own. Johnia found 2 part-time jobs at a jewelry store and a children's hospital. On the evening of December 5th, after finishing her shift at the store, she went to the shopping center to buy Christmas presents. When she returned home, she packed some gifts intended for the children at the educational center, chatted with her apartment neighbor, and went to her room. There, she talked to her boyfriend on the phone and went to sleep. Around 4 a.m., Jason Amami woke up to a woman's scream. He thought Johnia had a nightmare and headed to her room. At that moment, a man emerged from the room, and Jason noticed a knife in his hand. The assailant immediately attacked him and delivered several blows. The young man tried to defend himself and at some point managed to fend off the attacker, pushing him away, and ran out of the apartment. Jason quickly ran to the neighboring residential complex and began knocking on every door, hoping that someone would call the police, but no one opened for him. He then sprinted to the nearest 24-hour store, which was almost a kilometer away. Upon seeing the bloodied man, the store clerk immediately called 911, and Jason recounted what happened. The police arrived at his home and immediately discovered Johnia lying on the floor next to the corridor door that connected 5 apartments. The young woman was alive, but barely responsive to what was happening around her. As the paramedics prepared to load her into the ambulance, a police officer asked, "Is the attacker still in the apartment?" And he thought he saw Johnia nod ever so slightly. The officers thoroughly searched the entire building and the surrounding area, but failed to find him. The young woman was swiftly transported to the nearest hospital, but despite the efforts of the doctors, they were unable to save her. Medical experts determined that she had sustained over 20 knife wounds, leaving the doctors with virtually no chance of saving her life. As for her neighbor, the assailant had managed to inflict 8 wounds on him, with only 1 being serious. The medics provided him with the necessary care, and his life was not in danger. Meanwhile, detectives began investigating the crime scene. From the bloodstains in the corridor, they deduced that the young woman had attempted to reach out to her neighbors and seek help, but none of the 4 residents had opened their doors. Next to the door to Johnia's room, investigators found the murder weapon, a kitchen knife belonging to Jason. The assailant had struck with such force that the blade had bent. In addition, the police discovered blood traces near the back door of the apartment and on the staircase leading from the second floor to the street. Considering that Jason and Johnia had exited through the front door, the detectives made the most obvious conclusion. The murderer had left the crime scene through the back door. Another lead awaited them in Jason's room. They found a partial footprint, which the perpetrator may have left when following the apartment owner and launching the attack. Considering the brutality with which the killer had dealt with the young woman, the police suspected that the crime was personal in nature. Their first step was to closely scrutinize Johnia's fiancé, despite him being approximately 1,000 kilometers away from Knoxville. All friends and relatives attested to the couple having a wonderful relationship, and there seemed to be no motive for the fiancé to commit such a heinous crime. The young man only learned about his fiancé's death at 10 a.m. when her mother called him. He said that after hearing the news, he fainted and took a long time to recover. He had to ask his neighbor to book a plane ticket for him and pack his suitcase since he was incapable of doing anything himself. Detectives thoroughly examined his alibi and concluded that he physically couldn't have traveled to Knoxville and returned by morning. As a result, he was eliminated as a suspect, and the investigators turned their attention to Johnia's neighbor. Unlike the victim's fiancé, the neighbor had no alibi. Jason was in the same apartment as her and could have committed the crime. Friends and relatives of Johnia were also suspicious of him, with some considering him the most likely killer. Others accused him of fleeing the apartment and leaving the young woman alone, leading the victim's parents to not even want him to attend her funeral. Immediately after Jason was discharged from the hospital, the detectives began interrogating him. The young man stuck to his initial version of events. He woke up to a scream, saw an unknown man, and was attacked when he managed to push the assailant away. Jason rushed to the front door and ran outside, attempting to reach the neighbors. He believed that Johnia had also managed to leave the apartment since he no longer heard her screams. However, the police were hesitant to believe this account. The first thing that made them suspect Jason was his injuries. 7 out of the 8 wounds proved to be non-life-threatening, and the last one on his right hand could have been sustained during both defense and attack. Furthermore, forensic experts found no signs of forced entry in the apartment, indicating that the perpetrator was already inside. Jason himself mentioned that he had taken out the trash through the back door that evening, but couldn't remember if he had locked it or not. Detectives continued to press him, paying particular attention to the door he used to run out onto the street. Jason insisted that it was the front door, but the police suspected he was lying. If he had exited through the back door, it would explain the bloody traces near the door on the stairs. In that case, it would further implicate him. Additionally, the police accused him of using and selling illicit substances and behaving aggressively when unable to obtain a dose. Jason denied all of these allegations, but the investigators kept bombarding him with various accusations. After spending several hours with Jason at the police station, the detectives offered him a polygraph test, and he agreed. They brought in an expert who asked leading questions and, at the end of the interview, informed him that the polygraph indicated that he had given false answers. Upon hearing this, Jason entered a state of close to hysteria. He screamed that he had nothing to do with the crime and feared for his life, as the real perpetrator was still at large. However, the detectives didn't believe him. Nevertheless, they couldn't arrest him for murder since there was no evidence against Jason. They had to wait for the laboratory experts to finish examining the few pieces of evidence found in the apartment. Then, an unexpected turn of events occurred. On the knife used as the murder weapon, 3 DNA samples were found, those of the deceased young woman, Jason, and an unknown male. The unknown male's DNA was also discovered in Jonah's room, on the back door handle, and on the staircase used by the perpetrator to flee. Furthermore, a fingerprint left by the victim's blood was found on the knife handle, and it didn't match Jason's fingerprint. These discoveries made the police doubt that he was the killer. The evidence confirmed that someone else was indeed present in the apartment that night, but comparing the DNA samples to existing databases yielded no results. Despite the detectives no longer considering Jason as the murderer, public opinion remained against him. He was accused of fleeing and abandoning his girlfriend instead of trying to protect her. In addition to that, Jason began to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Soon, another interesting fact emerged. It turned out that the polygraph operator had simply misinterpreted the instrument's readings. In reality, there were no signs indicating that Jason was lying. Furthermore, the police had no actual evidence linking the young man to illicit substances. They accused him of it solely to exert additional pressure. Most importantly, the police initially downplayed the severity of the injuries Jason sustained. In reality, he had suffered serious harm, with his lung and neck being severely damaged. Full recovery was unlikely. Due to these police reports, the insurance company only covered 25% of the medical expenses, and Jason experienced significant financial difficulties. After he ceased being a suspect, the police began questioning Jason as a witness. Based on his statements, they created an approximate profile of the attacker. The situation was complicated by the fact that Jason couldn't clearly see the assailant's face, as the room was dark, and the perpetrator immediately attacked him when he exited the room. Detectives also discovered something interesting in Jonah's room: a cap, and near the back staircase, there were scattered discs and a stereo player. Initially, they assumed these items belonged to the victim or Jason, but Jason denied it. According to him, none of those belongings were in his apartment, implying that the killer left them behind. The investigators handed the approximate portrait of the suspect to journalists, and after its publication in the news, the police received hundreds of potential leads. People provided information about acquaintances who even remotely resembled the portrait, and the detectives followed up on each lead. One of them seemed particularly intriguing to a detective. They were informed that in the vicinity of Jonah's murder, there was a group of teenagers known for breaking into houses to commit theft. One of them, a 19-year-old named Michael Perkefell, resembled the suspect's portrait, and the police began searching for him. It wasn't easy since the young man was already wanted for theft. However, now that he was suspected of potential involvement in the murder, dozens of police officers joined the search. They eventually located him and brought him to the station. The investigators immediately noticed his footwear. The pattern on the soles resembled the footprint left by the killer. They collected a DNA sample and fingerprints from him and sent everything to the experts. Meanwhile, they interrogated him, and during the questioning, the detectives were in for an unexpected surprise. Michael confessed almost immediately that he and his friend had indeed broken into Jonah's apartment that night. According to Michael's account, their intention was to steal valuable items from Jonah's apartment, but his friend grabbed a knife and attacked her. However, the detectives quickly became skeptical of his story. Firstly, the details Michael provided didn't match the actual facts. And secondly, there were no traces of the presence of two outsiders at the crime scene. The laboratory result only confirmed their skepticism. Michael's DNA and fingerprints did not match those found at the murder scene. The same applied to his shoes. The pattern on the soles was different from the footprint in Jason's room. Eventually, the police realized that the young man was simply lying. As strange as it may sound, such situations occur quite often. Many high-profile cases involve individuals who take on someone else's guilt. Some do it to seek attention, while others lie in hopes of receiving rewards for information. It's unknown what motives drove Michael, but his story turned out to be fabricated. Since then, investigators have interviewed over 1,000 potential suspects and collected around 400 DNA samples, but they haven't found a single match. From the early weeks of the investigation, a reward was announced for information leading to the resolution of the case. The amount increased each month and reached $60,000 in December of 2005, 1 year after the murder. The state governor added $20,000 from his own pocket, which further drew public attention. Despite the numerous leads, all of them proved to be dead ends, and the case remained unresolved for several years. In 2007, the victims' parents decided to advocate for changes in the state's legislation. They found it astonishing that the perpetrator's fingerprints and DNA were not found in any of the databases, considering the brutality of the crime. The parents refused to believe that it was his first offense. Later, they learned that under the laws of Tennessee, fingerprints and DNA samples were only taken from convicted criminals. Johnia's parents resolved to rectify this situation and participated in the creation of a new law that mandated the collection of these samples from all individuals arrested for violent crimes. The authorities supported this initiative, and in May of 2007, such a law was enacted. 2 months later, a breakthrough finally occurred in the case. The police arrested 22-year-old Taylor Lee Olson for violating the terms of his parole. The man had been convicted of theft, and during a search of his home, marijuana bushes were discovered, leading to his rearrest. Olson had an extensive criminal history, primarily consisting of thefts, check forgery, and car thefts. He had been arrested multiple times, but his fingerprints and DNA were never taken until now. Despite living with his girlfriend and their newborn daughter, Olson regularly committed crimes. It turned out that Olson had already come to the attention of investigators 5 months prior. They received a tip about his possible involvement in the murder, but for some reason, the police never attempted to take his DNA for analysis. However, now that he was arrested for violating the terms of his parole, they finally decided to question him about the Johnia case. Olson denied his involvement in the murder and willingly agreed to provide his DNA sample. It was handed over to experts, and soon the detectives received a report from the laboratory. Taylor's DNA fully matched the sample found in the victim's apartment. Following this, his fingerprints were taken, and they also matched the print found on the murder weapon. Olson was subsequently arrested, and the detectives brought him in for questioning. At first, he denied his guilt, but soon he decided to confess. Taylor explained that on that night he wanted to steal Johnia's car and entered the apartment through the back door to take the keys. When he entered the young woman's room, she woke up and started screaming. That's when Olson grabbed a kitchen knife and struck her multiple times, although he claimed he did not intend to kill anyone and it all happened accidentally. The detectives doubted the truthfulness of some aspects of his account and leaned toward the belief that Taylor had initially planned the murder. It was possible that he had been stalking the victim for some time, indirectly supported by a fact mentioned earlier in the investigation. Johnia's friends told investigators that she had been followed by someone in a car. At the time, they couldn't find any evidence to confirm it, but after Olson's arrest, they considered the possibility that he had indeed been stalking her. Despite the doubts surrounding some details, nobody questioned Olson's guilt. His DNA and fingerprint were found on the murder weapon, indicating that he had inflicted the knife wounds on the victim. Olson's trial was scheduled to begin in mid-2008, and by that time, he had already hired a lawyer. Apparently, the lawyer advised him to retract his confession, and Taylor provided a new version of events to the detectives. Now he claimed that he had entered Johnia's apartment together with his friend named Noah Cox. According to Olson, when he entered Johnia's room to take the car keys, she allegedly woke up, grabbed a knife, and struck him multiple times. Olson ran out of the apartment through the back door, while his friend went into Johnia's room, where he grabbed a knife from her and killed the young woman. This account also did not convince the police. No fingerprints or DNA of other individuals were found at the crime scene, making the involvement of someone else unlikely. The detectives were awaiting the start of the trial, but it was never meant to happen. On March 28, 2008, Taylor Olson ended his life in his prison cell. Several suicide notes addressed to his family, Johnia's relatives, and the police were found next to him. In the letter to the detectives, he once again claimed that his friend Noah Cox was the actual killer and apologized to Johnia's family and his own. The detectives continued to believe that Olson was the one who committed the murder, yet they repeatedly questioned Noah, but no evidence of his involvement could be found. Johnia's parents also believed that he lied. In their opinion, if Taylor was truly innocent, he would not have taken his own life. It was much more likely that he simply didn't want to spend his entire life in prison. Moreover, for several months after his confession, Olson continued to maintain that he entered the apartment alone and that no one was with him. If he was trying to protect his friend, why did he suddenly retract his confession and start accusing him of the murder? Lynette Joy Dawson was born on May 5, 1948, in the Australian state of New South Wales. She grew up in a large, loving family with 2 brothers and a sister. Together with her parents, they lived in the small town of Clovelly, which is essentially a suburb of Sydney. Lynette was a cheerful child, had many friends, and always tried to help her loved ones. Her parents decided to send her to Sydney Girls High School, believing it would be the best choice for her. The school often held events in conjunction with Sydney Boys High School, and in 1965, at one of these events, Lynette met a boy named Chris Dawson. They were both 16 years old, and soon the couple began dating. After finishing school, Lynette decided to pursue a career in medicine. She wanted to help people, so she chose to become a nurse. At the same time, she took a part-time job at a child care center. When Chris and Lynette were 21, they decided to get married. The couple got married in 1970. The newlyweds moved to the northern suburb of Sydney called Bayview, where the woman got a job at a local hospital. Chris was actively involved in sports and played professional rugby since 1972. He had a twin brother named Paul, with whom they were in the same sports team. Later, they both decided to end their professional careers and became physical education coaches at one of the Sydney schools. Chris and Lynette dreamed of a large family, but they struggled to conceive for a long time. After 6 years of unsuccessful attempts, they began to consider adopting a child from an orphanage. But Lynette finally became pregnant, and the couple had their first daughter, followed by their second. Lynette and Chris were happy to finally have children. Their family seemed exemplary to friends and acquaintances, but soon the first signs of trouble began to appear in this idyllic picture. Lynette's friends started to notice bruises and injuries on her body periodically. When asked about it, Lynette claimed that it was nothing serious and her friends shouldn't worry about it. Lynette's friends were concerned for her, but they didn't see what was happening as something truly terrible. In those days, domestic violence wasn't considered a serious crime in the eyes of a significant portion of society in Australia. Moreover, everyone who knew Chris considered him a loving husband and caring father who never showed signs of aggression and was a positive person. Therefore, their friends tried not to interfere in their marriage and hoped that the couple would solve their problems. But the relationship between Lynette and Chris only continued to deteriorate. Lynette noticed that her husband had cooled towards her and was worried about the future of their family. A few years after the birth of their daughters, they decided to use the services of a nanny. Chris suggested this job to one of his 15-year-old school students, Bev McNally, but she didn't stay in this part-time job for long. She witnessed Chris raising his hand to Lynette twice and decided to leave. After this, Chris offered this job to another of his 16-year-old students, Joanne Curtis. After some time, Joanne had problems in her family, and Chris offered her to stay with them for some time, so she could spend more time looking after the children until the situation in her family improved. Despite her kindness and desire to help people, Lynette was against this. She was deeply concerned about the problems in their own family and didn't want someone else to be constantly present in their home. However, Chris insisted on it, and in October 1981, Joanne moved in with them. The young woman lived with them for about a month until Lynette discovered that her husband was sleeping with Joanne. It was a real shock for her and another blow to their marriage. She kicked Joanne out of the house but decided not to divorce Chris. Lynette wanted to keep their family together for the sake of their children, and she continued to love her husband despite his actions. Just a few months later, on December 3, 1981, Lynette faced yet another shock. Chris left her a note saying that he was leaving the family. He wrote that he would move to another city with Joanne and asked his wife not to portray him in a bad light to the children. Lynette was devastated by this news, but a few days later she was surprised again. Chris returned home because Joanne changed her mind about avoiding him in another city and asked to be taken back. Meanwhile, Chris spent New Year's Eve with Joanne, leaving his wife alone with the children. At that time, Joanne moved into Chris's brother's house, which was on the same street. Despite everything that was happening, Lynette wanted to keep their family together no matter what, so she decided to enroll in family therapy. Chris was against this idea, but she managed to convince him. She went to see the specialist right after New Year's, and it seemed that the therapy had a positive effect on their relationship. Chris started to spend more time with his wife and showed a desire to fix everything. On January 8, 1982, Lynette called her mother and told her that the family therapy was going well. They also agreed to meet with her and other relatives at the local beach the next day, and her mother thought that her daughter's speech sounded a bit unclear, as if Lynette was drunk. The woman explained that Chris had prepared some alcoholic drink for her. The next day, the relatives were waiting for Lynette on the beach, but she never showed up. They called her at home, and Chris said that he had driven his wife to the bus stop that morning. She was going to the store to return some clothes that didn't fit. However, she never returned home, and her relatives began to worry. In the evening, Chris called Lynette's mother and told her that his wife had contacted him by phone. She said that because of the problems in their marriage, she had decided to be away from home for a while and gather her thoughts. Her relatives thought that what was happening was strange, as they were aware of the problems that had been building up between the spouses for years, but they still couldn't imagine Lynette leaving her two daughters. She loved her children more than anything in the world and never mentioned considering the possibility of going somewhere. Days passed, but Lynette still didn't contact her family, which only added to their worry. On January 12th, Chris reported that Lynette had called their home phone and said that she was okay. Since then, he had spoken to her a few more times and told her relatives that she had been using her bank card. Despite this, her family continued to doubt that Lynette was okay. She didn't know how to drive and didn't take any items that she might need for living. She even left behind cash that was hidden in case of an emergency. 3 weeks later, Lynette's eldest daughter started first grade, as the school year in Australia begins in January, but Lynette missed this event, which caused even more concern for her relatives. They were practically certain that something bad had happened to her, while Chris said that she continued to regularly call home, and the last such call was at the end of January. Since then, Lynette hadn't been in contact. On February 18th, 6 weeks after Lynette left home, her husband went to the police. He filed a missing person report and expressed suspicion that amid all the problems in their marriage, Lynette could have joined some religious organization or even a cult. Her relatives denied such a possibility, as Lynette was not religious and didn't attend church. The police began a search, but they had absolutely no leads. Lynette's mother and other members of her family were certain that she would never leave home, abandoning her daughters, so they believed that she had been kidnapped or some other tragedy had occurred. Despite this, the police concluded that Lynette had indeed left home, as they had no evidence of the contrary. They tried to find her for some time and then stopped the investigation. Chris posted a message for Lynette in a local newspaper, calling for her to come home. He wrote that he loved her and was eagerly awaiting her call. He also called all of her friends, trying to find any information about his wife's whereabouts. Despite Chris's eagerness to find Lynette, he divorced her a year after her disappearance, and the next year he married Joanne Curtis, his former student and lover, who had moved in with him on January 10, 1982, a day after Lynette went missing. Joanne became the stepmother of Lynette's daughters, and Chris, not wanting to traumatize the children with the stories of their mother's disappearance, told them that Joanne was their real mother. Lynette's relatives were not happy about what was happening, but they couldn't do anything about it. They stopped relying on the police, as they had long ago stopped investigating due to the complete lack of leads. Moreover, they didn't even try to question all of her relatives and friends, and the case was abandoned almost immediately without a proper investigation. Chris and Joanne moved to Queensland with the children, selling their old house. Chris almost completely cut ties with his former wife's relatives, only occasionally calling her mother. Later, Chris and Joanne had a daughter. 6 years passed, and during that time, Lynette never contacted anyone. This continued until 1990, when something unexpected happened. Chris and Joanne divorced, and soon after that, Joanne contacted Lynette's relatives to pass on shocking information. She said that she had suspected her husband of murdering his ex-wife all this time. According to her, a month before Lynette's disappearance, Chris had talked about hiring a hitman to get rid of her. On the very day she disappeared, he told Joanne that Lynette had left forever and would never return. She also advised the police to search the backyard of the house where Lynette and Chris lived. In 1991, the police questioned Chris. He said that his ex-wife was just trying to tarnish his name and that he had nothing to do with Lynette's disappearance. He admitted that the woman was intentionally doing this to get custody of their daughter after the divorce. At that time, the court was deciding who would have custody of their child, and Chris's arrest would have been beneficial to Joanne. Police seized phones from Chris and his brother, but nothing suspicious was found. So investigators once again abandoned the case, considering Joanne's words dubious. The case remained dormant for another 9 years until 2000, when police decided to excavate the backyard of Chris's old home. But there was a catch. Due to insufficient funding, they only dug around the pool area. This area was chosen after police talked to the new homeowners. According to them, during the sale, Chris persistently asked if they planned to change anything exactly in this place. The only thing that the police managed to find was a torn pink cardigan. Investigators admitted that it could have belonged to Lynette and contained some evidence, but DNA analysis found no matches with Lynette. A year later, the case was once again brought to attention. This time, the deputy state prosecutor concluded that Lynette was killed by someone she knew. Police resumed the investigation, questioning her friends and relatives, but they failed to find any leads. Only in 2003, 2 years later, investigators publicly announced that they considered Chris a suspect. They wanted to charge him with murder, but it never happened. Due to the complete lack of evidence, the man could not be convicted. But investigators managed to find many witnesses who reported that Chris and his brother regularly had intimate relationships with their school students. However, no charges were brought on this matter, and as a result, the case stalled again. In 2006, Chris claimed that he saw his wife among the extras of a series filmed in England, but no one could find any evidence to support his words. In 2010, police announced a $100,000 reward for information about Lynette's disappearance, and 4 years later, they doubled the amount. Despite the large number of appeals, this did not bring any results, and they failed to find any reliable leads. In cases where a monetary reward is promised, there are always many people who want to earn some extra money. They are ready to make up any information just to get the money. In 2015, police dug up a section of Chris's former home trying to find his wife's body, but they were unsuccessful. The turning point in this case came in 2018 when a podcast about Lynette's disappearance was released and gained massive popularity in Australia. Arguments were presented in favor of Lynette's husband being responsible for her murder. The podcast was listened to by several million people, which led to a wave of public outrage. Australians accused the police of negligence and demanded that the culprit be punished. The podcast's author, Hedley Thomas, spoke to Lynette's relatives and tried to find new leads. Although he was unable to find any new evidence against Chris, the public outcry was enough to initiate a new investigation. As a result, on December 5th of that year, detectives arrested Chris for the first time on charges of murder. He continued to insist on his innocence and was released on bail before the start of the trial. The wait dragged on for several years. In 2019, he appeared before a judge and claimed that he did not kill his wife and that the trial should have started in 2020. But Chris's lawyers consistently delayed the process. They insisted that due to the widespread coverage of the case in the media, their client had a biased attitude towards him, so they demanded that they abandon the jury and conduct a trial where the judge would make the decision. In May 2022, this demand was approved and the trial finally began. Chris's lawyers insisted that there was not a single piece of evidence against their client, and all the charges were based on societal bias due to the podcast. According to them, the author presented his opinion in such a way that many believed in Chris's guilt and refused to adequately evaluate the situation. Despite the lack of direct evidence on the prosecution side, they built their case on a multitude of indirect factors. Relatives and acquaintances of Lynette, who had repeatedly seen signs of abuse on her body, testified in court, and Lynette had admitted to them that Chris was responsible. Their neighbors, who witnessed the man beating her, also testified in court. They recounted that the day before Lynette's disappearance, when she returned to family therapy, she had bruises on her neck. One of the key witnesses was Joanne, who revealed that as she grew older, she realized how unhealthy her relationship with Chris was. He became obsessed with her when she was only 15 years old. He would leave notes in her backpack at school and ask her out on dates. He was persistent and didn't take no for an answer, so the young woman felt like she had nowhere to turn. According to Joanne, Chris completely controlled her life. He told her what to wear, who to talk to, and what to do. He monitored her every move and couldn't stand it when things didn't go according to his plan. As a result, the woman concluded that the man could have easily killed his wife. According to the prosecution, Chris had wanted to end the marriage for a long time, but he would have lost part of his property and custody of the children in the divorce. So he decided to kill Lynette and stage her disappearance. In addition, he wanted to get rid of her so that she wouldn't interfere with his relationship with Joanne. Chris's lawyers, on the other hand, insisted that Joanne had made all of this up to intentionally slander her ex-husband. They also called several witnesses who claimed to have seen Lynette years after her disappearance. These testimonies became the mainstay of the defense, but there was no evidence to support their claims. The prosecution believed that these testimonies were simply fabricated, and that if Lynette was alive, she would have contacted her relatives and daughters over the years. As for the phone calls that Chris allegedly received in the first month of her disappearance, no evidence of their existence could be found. The prosecution argued that the woman was already dead at that time, and the man made it all up to convince Lynette's relatives that she was okay. In their view, Chris killed the woman on January 9th, drove her body in an unknown direction, and hid it. Because the police were negligent in their work in those years, no proper investigation was conducted, although the killer's motives were always obvious. The trial lasted for 10 weeks, and on August 30th, 2022, the judge found Chris guilty. A few months later, in early December, the sentence was announced: 24 years in prison with the possibility of applying for early release after 18 years of imprisonment. Considering that he will be 92 years old by then, Chris may simply not live to see that time. After the sentence was handed down, Lynette's relatives, including her eldest daughter, spoke. She no longer doubted that her father had killed her mother and said that his actions had destroyed her life. The woman demanded that her father confess where he had hidden Lynette's body so that the family could finally bury her. Chris remained silent and looked at the floor while his daughter spoke. Despite the fact that almost 41 years have passed since Lynette's murder, her relatives still hope to find her remains. Chris, who is now 74 years old, continues to insist on his innocence, but even his own children do not believe him. Thus, one of Australia's most high-profile cases was solved, in large part, thanks to a podcast that drew the attention of millions of people to this unjust story. If the police had conducted a proper investigation from the beginning, the killer could have been punished immediately after the crime, not after 4 decades. Michelle Young was born on February 17, 1977, in the small American town of Sayville, New York. From an early age, the girl was characterized by perseverance and determination. She set ambitious goals for herself and made every effort to achieve them. In school, she excelled academically and was captain of the cheerleading team. She also chose a career path quite early in life. Michelle planned to become a tax lawyer. To obtain the necessary education, Michelle enrolled at NC State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. She also joined the local cheerleading team, but later decided to leave it and fully focus on her studies. 4 years later, she earned a master's degree, and almost immediately after that, she got a job at a local accounting company. Despite the fact that Michelle had just started her career path, her position provided a decent income right from the start. She rented an apartment in a good area and devoted a large part of her time to climbing the career ladder. In February 2001, while celebrating her 24th birthday with friends, Michelle met a man named Jason. He was several years older and had graduated from the same university as her. The couple quickly found common ground, and soon they started dating. Jason worked as a sales agent in a large company that produced power tools. He lived in another city, and at the time of their meeting, he was in Raleigh on business. After meeting Michelle, he started visiting there more often, and at other times, they communicated by phone. Later, he permanently moved to the city, and after some time, he and Michelle started living together. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant, and in August 2003, the couple decided to get married. On March 29, 2004, their daughter, Cassidy, was born, and the family moved into a large house located in a prestigious area on the outskirts of the city. Around the same time, Michelle's sister, Meredith, moved to Raleigh and regularly helped the family take care of the child. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant again, and she and her husband decided to visit Jason's parents to celebrate the news. They lived in a city called Brevard, which was 400 kilometers away from their home. Unfortunately, instead of a celebration, the trip turned into a tragedy. On the very day the couple planned to return to Raleigh, Jason and Michelle were involved in a serious accident that caused her pregnancy to be terminated. The family was devastated by the news, but just 2 months later, Michelle became pregnant again. After a while, the couple found out that they were having a boy, and they eagerly awaited his birth. On November 2, 2006, Jason left for another city for work. As a sales agent, he regularly traveled around the country for business meetings and negotiations. This time, he was headed to a town called Clintwood, which was about 490 kilometers away. That day, Michelle invited her friend, Shelley, to visit. The women talked until evening, after which the friend went home. The next morning, Jason called his wife's sister, Meredith, and told her that before leaving for another city, he found some designer women's bags on an online store with a good discount and wanted to order one for Michelle as a gift for their 3rd anniversary. After his departure, he remembered that he had printed out several pages with these bags and left them on the table in his home office. Jason did not want his wife to see them and learn about the upcoming gift, so he asked her sister to go to their house and take them. Meredith agreed and came to their house at around 1 p.m. At that moment, she did not have the keys with her, and Michelle was supposed to be at work. But the woman knew that the door to their garage was broken and could be easily lifted by hand. She did just that, but immediately noticed something strange. Her sister's car was parked inside. Thinking that she had gone to work, Meredith walked into the house. Upon entering the kitchen, she saw Michelle's purse lying on the floor. The woman called her sister by name, but there was no answer. Instead, she heard their dog barking, which was also strange. When Jason and Michelle left the house, they always let the dog out into the backyard. Climbing upstairs, the woman noticed something red on the floor in the bedroom. Approaching closer, she realized with horror that it was a blood stain, and next to it was her sister Michelle. She was lying face down. Meredith approached her sister and tried to turn her over, but immediately felt that her sister's body was cold. The woman panicked and immediately called 911. At the same time, Cassidy, the 2-year-old girl who was hiding under the bed next to where the body lay, crawled out and ran to her aunt when she saw her. Meredith called the police and led her outside, where they waited for the officers. When the woman was speaking to the operator, he asked, "Is the child okay?" Meredith examined her and found no visible injuries. The only thing she noticed was small blood stains all over the room, which she immediately realized were the child's footprints. The child was immediately handed over to the doctors for examination, and the police began to investigate the crime scene. They immediately noticed something strange. There were bloody footprints of a child all over the room. However, Kennedy's feet were completely clean. Additionally, there wasn't a single drop of blood on the girl. The footprints led to the bathroom in only one direction. Bloodstains were found on the inside of the bathroom door, apparently left by the child's hand. Based on all of this, the detectives constructed the most obvious version of what had happened. After the murder, the girl was locked in the bathroom for a while, and then someone came in and washed Cassidy clean of blood. Later, when the police talked to Michelle's friend, they learned another interesting fact. Shelley said that they put the girl to sleep together the night before, and she was wearing a diaper. However, when the victim's sister came to her house, The child was not wearing a diaper. Based on this, the investigators concluded that the same person who washed the blood off the child also removed the diaper. The detectives did not find any signs of a break-in in the house. They discovered that Michelle's 2 rings, wedding and engagement, were missing from her hand, but all other valuables were in their place, including cash, ruling out the scenario of robbery. 2 small hairs that did not belong to the victim were found on her body and near her, and 4 DNA samples were found on the jewelry box that did not belong to Michelle or her husband. Several fingerprints were also found in the house that did not belong to anyone in their family. In the bedroom where the victim's body was found, experts discovered 2 shoe prints of American size 10 and 12, with the pattern on the soles. They were even able to determine the model of the shoes. Additionally, detectives noticed blood splatters on the door of the closet with clothing. However, the door was open and the splatters were arranged in a way that suggested the door should have been closed when they landed. On Jason's home office computer, the police found something interesting in the browsing history. Besides pages from a women's handbag store and a search for directions to Clintwood, there were several alarming search queries such as anatomy of a knockout, loss of consciousness from head trauma, and related topics. Medical experts concluded that Michelle died from a head injury inflicted by a heavy object. The perpetrator struck her over 30 times, and at the time of her death, she was 5 months pregnant and her baby did not survive the attack. The exact time of Michelle's death was not determined, but experts speculated that it most likely occurred at 5 or 6 in the morning. The brutality of the crime suggested that the perpetrator may have known the victim and harbored a strong dislike towards her. As usual, the detectives first looked into Michelle's husband. They spoke with her friends and relatives who provided them with a lot of interesting information. Their marriage was quite problematic as Jason and Michelle often argued over domestic issues. Furthermore, Jason was not happy when his wife became pregnant with their first child. He asked her to terminate the pregnancy, but Michelle refused. When Michelle became pregnant again after an accident they were involved in, Jason was once again not pleased with the news. It seemed like the couple might divorce in the foreseeable future. Meredith also told the police that Jason's request to retrieve the handbag printouts initially seemed strange to her, considering the obvious problems in their marriage, and it had already been over 3 weeks since their anniversary. However, one obvious fact contradicted the theories of Jason's involvement. At the time of the murder, he was in another city that was 490 kilometers away. After Michelle's sister discovered her body and called the police, she also informed their relatives about what had happened. Michelle's mother called Jason's parents while he was on his way from Clintwood to visit them. He decided to stop by his parents' house before heading home, and upon arrival, they told him about what had happened. Jason was shocked by the news and immediately left for Raleigh with other relatives. During this trip, a friend called Jason and told him that the police were asking a lot of questions about him. Jason made a strange decision and said he didn't want to talk to the police and wanted to hire a lawyer, which only increased the investigators' suspicions, but also gave them a new lead. Shelley, who was visiting the victim the day before the murder, told the police something interesting. Michelle had told her that she had been feeling like someone was constantly watching her lately. Shelley herself also felt like someone was watching them through the window that evening and even asked her friend to walk her to her car because she was a little scared to leave the house alone. Detectives tried to find any evidence related to possible surveillance, but continued to investigate Jason's potential involvement. Jason left his house in his car on November 2nd in the afternoon, and considering it was about a 6-hour drive to Clintwood, he decided to stop and stay at the Hampton Hotel, which is roughly halfway on the route. Detectives requested surveillance footage from this hotel and actually saw Jason check in at 10:54 p.m. And 2 minutes later, he used his key card to enter his room, and the card was not used again after that. The next morning, around 7:40 a.m., he called his mother, and the signal passed through a cell tower located near the town of Whiteville. This town was on the way from the hotel to Clintwood, where his business meeting was supposed to take place. The police also found out that the meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., but Jason arrived 30 minutes late. When Jason arrived home with his relatives, the police seized his white Ford Explorer. Forensic experts could not find any blood or other evidence in it. They also examined the hotel room where the man stayed, but nothing was found there either. The same applied to all of Jason's clothing and belongings. Interesting, a pair of size 12 boots of the same brand were found in his car, the tracks of which were discovered in the house, but it was a model with a completely different pattern on the sole. A DNA sample was taken from the man by court order, which did not match the 2 hairs found on the victim's body. His fingerprints were also taken, although this was not particularly useful as they were everywhere in his home, of course. Experts could only determine that none of the fingerprints found contained traces of blood. Thus, the police were unable to find any evidence that could connect Jason to the murder. He did not speak to the police and used the services of a lawyer. Another fact indirectly spoke in favor of his innocence. When the police searched Jason's car, they found a hotel receipt and a fresh newspaper. A Hampton employee said he had slipped them under the door of his room somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. This meant that the man was definitely in the hotel that morning. In the end, a rather complex situation arose. Jason could have killed his wife only if he had left the hotel unnoticed in the middle of the night, driven 270 kilometers to his home, committed the crime, cleaned his daughter of blood, then driven 270 kilometers back and quietly entered his room so that the electronic key did not register it. Detectives tried to figure out if this was possible in principle. They interviewed hotel staff, and here they came across an interesting lead. Early in the morning on November 3rd, one of the employees noticed that the fire door on the first floor was slightly open, held open by a small red stone. The employee was surprised because this door was always closed from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. He pulled out the stone from under the door and closed it. After that, the man decided to check the surveillance cameras and saw that one of them was not working, the one located on the stairwell next to the door. The employee approached it and realized that someone had disconnected the wire from the camera. He asked his colleague to return the wire to its place, and around 5:50 a.m., the camera started working again. From the recordings, the detectives established that the camera was turned off at 11:19 p.m. Then, something interesting happened at 6:35 a.m. Less than an hour after the camera was reconnected, it suddenly turned to face the ceiling. Given that there was no automatic mechanism to change its position, there was only one option. Someone manually turned the camera so it wouldn't face the hallway. The hotel management claimed that the camera had never been turned off before, and the only time someone turned it towards the ceiling was a few years ago when a guest wanted to leave the hotel unnoticed. This was a significant argument for the detectives that Jason could have left the hotel and gone home, then returned. The idea with the door and the camera was evident. The hotel's fire doors are designed in such a way that they can only be opened from inside the room. Jason could have used this door to leave the hotel without going through the main entrance, as he would have been seen by the employees and other cameras. Investigators interviewed all of Michelle's neighbors, and interesting clues awaited them here as well. On the night of the murder, around 4 a.m., a woman was delivering fresh newspapers to their area near Michelle's house when she noticed a light-colored SUV, but couldn't remember the model. Another neighbor left for work around 5:20 a.m. and also noticed a white SUV near Jason and Michelle's house. Passing by, she saw a man behind the wheel, but couldn't make out his face. What was even more interesting was that there was a woman sitting next to him in the passenger seat. The neighbor thought she was trying to hide her face from her. The third witness drove past her house around 6:15 a.m. and also saw a white SUV there, but no one was inside. Detectives believed that this car belonged to Jason, but it was a complete surprise to them that there was a woman in the car with him. Attempts to identify her were unsuccessful, but during the investigation, detectives found out that the man had been cheating on his wife with her friend since college. The woman lived in Florida, and Jason regularly went to see her under the guise of business trips. Detectives also discovered that the day before Michelle's murder, the lovers had called each other about 50 times, but the content of their conversations was unknown. Despite all this, the police still had no evidence linking Jason to the murder. He still refused to talk to the police without his lawyer present, but even in the presence of the attorney, he did not answer their questions. Detectives continued to actively work on the case, and ultimately, the investigation dragged on for many months. They were almost certain that it was Jason who committed the murder, but without substantial evidence, they were not in a hurry to arrest him. This happened only on December 14, 2009, 3 years after the murder. The investigators realized they would not be able to find any new evidence, so they gathered all the available materials and charged him with murder. The trial began 2 years later in June 2011. The prosecution insisted that Jason had premeditated the murder of his wife because he did not want to lose part of his property in the divorce. According to their version, he had initially decided to stay at that particular hotel because it would allow him to return home to commit the murder and then drive back. Former girlfriends of Jason also testified at the trial. One of them recounted that he had proposed to her and given her a ring, but later, during an argument, he grabbed her hand and took the ring off her finger. Given that the killer had removed the rings from Michelle's hand, these statements seemed significant to the prosecution, and another woman turned out to be Jason's second mistress and a friend of Michelle. She revealed that she spent time with the man at his home when Michelle went somewhere. She was also married, and on one of those nights, Jason removed her engagement ring from her finger. He did not return it until the next day, which seemed strange to the woman. Another mistress, a college friend of Michelle, also testified at the trial. She admitted that they had a romance, but the prints of their correspondence turned out to be much more interesting. Just a few days before the murder, he wrote to her, "I don't know how it all turned out this way, but I know how it will all end, with 2 broken hearts, but I don't care. I have a lot of suffering ahead of me, but you are worth it, even if only for a moment." Given that Michelle was killed just a few days after this message, its content was very disturbing. But one of the main witnesses was a woman who worked at a gas station between Raleigh and the town where Jason's hotel was located. She recounted that around 5:20 a.m., a man in a white SUV pulled up to the farthest pump. He tried to fill his car, but by law, people had to pay for gas first or show their ID at night. The driver went into the gas station and shouted at the employee, then threw $20 at her, filled the car with $15 worth of gas, and drove away without taking the change. The woman claimed to recognize this man from the photo. It was Jason Young. This witness changed the course of the case, as thanks to her it became known that Jason was between his home and the hotel early in the morning. This once again pointed to the fact that he could have killed his wife. At the trial, Michelle's sister, Meredith, also testified. After Michelle's murder, her daughter Cassidy stayed with her father, who moved in with his parents. For a long time, Michelle's relatives tried to obtain a court decision allowing them to take the girl to live with them temporarily. This went on for several years, and the lawyers were close to obtaining a positive decision when Jason simply relinquished full custody of Meredith, practically abandoning her. As a result, the girl moved in with her mother's relatives, who have been raising her without her father's involvement since then. Jason spoke for the first time at the trial, telling his version of events and denying that he killed his wife. He admitted that their marriage was falling apart, but insisted that they would have eventually divorced, and he had no motive to kill her. His lawyers argued that there was no evidence against Jason, and also tried to convince everyone that he could not physically have driven such a distance to kill his wife and return to the hotel early in the morning. They tried to calculate the average fuel consumption of his car and compare it with data on how often he refueled. According to the lawyers, he would not have had enough fuel to make the trip. However, verifying this version was not possible. Nonetheless, the jurors could not reach a unanimous decision, and the judge was forced to declare a mistrial and schedule a new one for a year later. Against this backdrop, something else important happened. Michelle's relatives were convinced that Jason killed her, so they decided to file a civil lawsuit against him. Unlike in criminal trials, the required level of evidence for such lawsuits is lower, and the judge cannot sentence a person to prison. Jason completely ignored this lawsuit and decided not to participate in the process, which worked against him. After examining all the available evidence, the judge concluded that he was the one who killed his wife, and Jason was ordered to pay $15 million to Michelle's relatives. In the retrial, which began in 2012, the prosecution was allowed to use the decision in the civil lawsuit as an argument in favor of the suspect's guilt. In addition, they discovered something else during the preparation. It turned out that a year before Jason's murder, he had bought boots with the same pattern, the bloody imprint of which was left in Michelle's room, but they had not been able to find those shoes. These additional factors only strengthened the case against Jason, and this time, the jury found him guilty of murder. The man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His lawyers tried to challenge the decision, and they continue to file appeals to this day, but all of them are rejected. This case was widely covered in the media, and its finale sparked heated discussions. On the one hand, over all these years, no physical evidence has been found that would connect Jason to the murder. On the other hand, a huge range of circumstantial evidence indicated that the man had orchestrated almost a perfect cover-up. If he had not stopped at the gas station that morning and had not caused a scene with the cashier, she might not have remembered his face. In that case, this case would still remain unsolved. As for the woman who was seen by a neighbor in the passenger seat of his car that night, everything is very ambiguous. There are no other clues that would indicate the involvement of other people in this crime. Other people's hair and DNA in the house did not guarantee this. It could have been left by one of the guests long before the murder. Nevertheless, the prosecution did not rule out 100% that someone could have helped Jason, but this moment remains a mystery. Stephanie Bennett was born on August 30th, 1979, in the small American town of Rocky Mount, Virginia. When she was little, her parents divorced, and Stephanie stayed with her mother. However, their father lived near their home, and the young woman continued to see him almost every day. Later, her father remarried, and Stephanie gained a stepsister named Diana. After school, Stephanie enrolled in Roanoke College, located 350 kilometers from her home. In her final year, she met a guy named Walter, and they soon started dating. After college, the couple moved to different cities, but they continued to be together. Stephanie moved to the city of Raleigh, North Carolina with her stepsister Diana and their mutual friend Emily. The three of them rented an apartment in the Bridgeport residential complex, located in a quiet, peaceful area on the outskirts of the city. The young woman found a job at IBM while her boyfriend moved to Greenville, South Carolina to obtain an engineering degree. Stephanie lived in Raleigh for about a year. By that time, she and her sister and friend were planning to move to different cities. The young woman, who was only 23 at the time, was planning to move to Greenville to be with her boyfriend, and the couple had already begun looking for a place to rent. In May, Stephanie went to Greenville, where she and Walter looked at several apartments and chose a suitable option for rent. When she returned to Raleigh, her friends and sister were no longer in the apartment. Emily had moved to another city, and Diana had gone away for a few days to attend a funeral. On the evening of May 20th, Stephanie came home from work and spoke to Walter on the phone. Her boyfriend was planning to send her a rental agreement via fax for her to sign. They agreed that he would send it the next day when she could use her work computer. The following day, Walter tried to reach her, but Stephanie didn't answer either her work or home phone. He then called her sister Diana, who contacted Stephanie's colleagues. It turned out that Stephanie didn't show up to work that day, which was very unusual. Stephanie was always responsible and would have informed her boss if she was sick. Moreover, if she was at home sick, she would have answered the phone. Diana asked her friend to go to their apartment and check if everything was okay. There was no answer when they knocked on the door. Then Diana asked the apartment manager to open the door with a spare key. As soon as the man entered the apartment, he saw a horrifying sight. Stephanie was lying lifeless on the floor of the room, with no clothes on and bruises on her neck. The manager immediately called the police. Detectives found Stephanie's documents and confirmed that the deceased was indeed her through a photo. On the laundry basket cover, which was under the window in Emily's bedroom, investigators noticed leaves and concluded that the killer may have entered the apartment through the window. They also discovered that the home phone was in the closet in Emily's room and the cable was cut. Apparently, the perpetrator was hiding there and took the phone with him, so Stephanie couldn't use it. After speaking with Diana, the police determined that several items were missing from the apartment. The perpetrator took $8 from Stephanie's wallet, 2 tape recorders, and the laundry basket from Stephanie's room. It seemed that he had put the stolen items inside the basket. Experts found semen on the victim's body and extracted a DNA sample, but it wasn't in the FBI database. They also determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Interestingly, the perpetrator took the object he used to kill the victim with, as the police were unable to find it in the apartment. Meanwhile, investigators interviewed all the residents of the complex, hoping someone might have seen the killer. During these conversations, the police learned that something strange had been happening in the residential complex for several months. People regularly noticed someone peeping at them through the windows of their apartments. They complained to the manager, but the management of the complex could not find the person. Interestingly, at least once this person was seen at Stephanie's window. In addition, several months ago, an unknown man near the lake near the complex assaulted a young woman who went for a run. After this incident, Stephanie was afraid to stay alone in this apartment and wanted to move to Greenville as soon as possible. Detectives studied the area around the complex and discovered something strange. In the bushes, they found dozens of pieces of women's underwear, which, as later turned out, belonged to Stephanie. The police thought the killer took them out of the apartment, but then, for some reason, threw them in the bushes. However, soon this version was refuted. It turned out that a teenager living in the neighboring apartment regularly sneaked into Stephanie's room and stole her underwear, after which he threw it into the bushes. He admitted this when investigators questioned all the residents. but he denied his involvement in the murder. His DNA sample was taken, and it did not match the sample obtained from the killer's semen. For this reason, he was no longer suspected of the crime. The police believed that the most obvious candidate for the role of the killer was the same man who repeatedly peeped at the female residents of the complex through the windows. After talking to everyone who had ever noticed this person, the detectives compiled an approximate portrait. It was published in newspapers, but it did not yield any results. As part of the standard procedure, investigators checked the victim's boyfriend. He voluntarily gave his DNA, which did not match the killer's sample. In addition, at the time of the murder, Walter was hundreds of kilometers away from her home and physically could not have been there. After that, the police went to all the male residents of the complex, asking them to voluntarily give their DNA. This also did not yield any results. The experts did not find a single match among the 283 samples obtained. At this point, they did not have any serious leads. Detectives organized surveillance of the residential complex, hoping to catch the man who was spying on the residents. To their surprise, they quickly succeeded. On June 3rd, the police noticed a man who approached several windows on the ground floor and peered into the apartments. Stopping at one of the windows, this person began to satisfy himself, and the police immediately arrested him. This pervert turned out to be Christopher Lee Campen, who had been caught spying several times before and had been convicted of stalking a woman 3 years earlier. The detectives thought they had finally caught the killer, but they were disappointed. Christopher's DNA did not match the sample found on the victim's body. He was charged with spying, but they stopped considering him a suspect in the murder case. Since then, the police continued to work on the case, but they had no substantial leads. A year later, the lead detective heard about a lab in Florida that could determine a person's ethnicity based on their DNA. However, he had doubts about this technology, but he didn't want to miss such an opportunity. As a test, he sent the DNA of 4 of his colleagues of different ethnicities to the lab. The experts succeeded in their task 100%, and the detective sent them the DNA of Stephanie's killer. The lab determined that the DNA belonged to a white person, but this information did not help the police much. In August 2003, the victim's father offered a reward of $100,000 for any information that would lead to the capture of the killer. Her mother wrote a letter which was published in local newspapers, begging people to share with the police any information that could help identify the suspect. All of this brought some new leads, but they did not lead anywhere. In April 2004, based on the testimony of multiple witnesses, detectives decided to interview all residents of the complex again. They suspected that the man arrested for voyeurism might not have been the only one who walked around the complex buildings and peeked into other people's windows. Knowing the identity of the first man and having his photographs, the investigators wanted to talk to the residents who had seen the voyeur again. Unfortunately, none of them had ever seen his face. Most often, this man appeared at night, and he almost always wore a hood. However, some witnesses said they saw him without the hood, but could only see that he had long hair. Detectives interviewed several dozen people until they finally reached the man who saw this person right in front of Stephanie's window before her murder. His testimony was already with the police, but this time he remembered something else. The witness claimed that he saw this person a few days after the incident during daylight hours. This man was walking his dog near the wooded area behind the residential complex, and the witness recognized him by his hoodie. He watched him for a while until he disappeared behind the trees with his Labrador. Apparently, the witness simply forgot about this incident or did not think it was related to the murder, so during the initial questioning, the police did not receive this information. One thing is for sure, detectives only obtained this information 2 years after Stephanie's death. Now they knew they should be looking for a man with a Labrador. Judging by the fact that this person was walking his dog in the area, he must have lived nearby. And here the detective noted one interesting fact. Behind the forested area where the witness saw the man, there was another residential complex. Given that the dog owner headed in that direction, he could well have lived there. The police went there and asked the staff if there was a man with a Labrador among the complex residents. They immediately gave them the name of 35-year-old Drew Planton, as well as added a few interesting details. All the complex employees considered him somewhat strange. He hardly talked to anyone, never looked people in the eye, and was generally very unsociable. The man was very thin with long hair and always wore baggy clothes. Many people thought he was trying to attract as little attention as possible. In his case, however, it worked just the opposite. The police decided to find out more about this person and talk to an elderly resident who, according to the staff, kept an eye on everything happening in the complex. And here, they were in for a very unexpected turn. When they told her they were investigating the murder of Stephanie Bennett, the woman replied, "Haven't you arrested anyone yet? Everyone knows it was that guy with the big dog." The detectives were, to say the least, shocked. It took them 2 years to get to this person, and the residents of his complex initially suspected this man, but none of them deemed it necessary to share their suspicions with the police. It turned out that Drew had moved out of that complex and settled on the other side of town. The investigators decided to talk to him and came to his apartment, but no one responded to their knock on the door. They came there several more times at different times of the day and never received an answer. Either the man was never home or he intentionally did not open the door for them. While they tried to locate Drew, the police questioned his former neighbors at his old place of residence. They managed to find several witnesses who shared troubling facts. A woman living on the floor above had seen Drew in the company of a young boy a few days after Stephanie's murder. They were walking down the street and talking about something. According to the witness, Drew asked the boy to stop contacting the police and not to tell them anything. The investigators immediately concluded that the young man in question was the same teenager who had stolen underwear from the victim's apartment. Several women had reported being genuinely afraid of Drew, having spotted him during their runs or walks in secluded areas. The man would either closely observe them or even follow them. Detectives who had been unable to speak with Drew found his place of work and headed there. He was a chemist at a fertilizer production laboratory, and the investigators managed to catch him at his workplace. He immediately stated that he had not heard of Stephanie Bennett's murder, which was strange considering that he lived just a kilometer away from her complex at the time. The man clearly had no desire to talk to the police and told them he was very busy at the moment. Drew told the investigators that they could come to his home at an appointed time, and he would answer all their questions. The detectives met him at his apartment, and the man finally opened the door to them. During the conversation, he stated that he had never walked his dog near Stephanie's complex. However, given that the police had many witnesses who had repeatedly seen him in that area, the investigators immediately understood that he was lying. The man also claimed that he did not wear glasses, even though his driver's license indicated that he was required to wear them while driving, and several witnesses had reported that the man who was peeping into the windows of other apartments wore glasses. As expected, Drew refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. The detectives then decided to conduct surveillance on him, hoping to obtain a sample in a different way. However, this proved to be a very difficult task since the man did not leave behind any items that could be sent to the laboratory. For example, during lunch breaks, he would leave work, sit in his car, and just stare at one point. The man did not eat anything, so the investigators could not obtain any objects with his DNA. Once they noticed Drew throwing an empty water bottle into a garbage bin. Detectives took it and sent it to the laboratory, but experts were unable to extract a DNA sample from it. According to one version, Drew took someone else's bottle and purposely threw it on the street, knowing that he was being watched. After that, the police decided to obtain his garbage, but here too they were unsuccessful. For several days they never saw Drew take it out. Interestingly, the man's neighbors also could not remember ever seeing him with the trash bag. Next, investigators asked Drew's boss for help. The woman agreed to help them obtain any item from his workplace that might contain Drew's DNA. She watched him for several days, but was unable to get a hold of any item. Drew rarely ate at work, never threw anything away, and she couldn't find a single hair on his desk, which seemed strange given that the man had fairly long hair. Investigators were already convinced that Drew was intentionally covering up all traces to prevent them from obtaining his DNA. One day, the boss saw him tying his hair back with a rubber band and then bending down to pick up all the hairs that fell in the process. After that, the woman decided to invite him for a lunch break at a cafe to supposedly discuss some work matters. But even there, the man was extremely cautious. He mostly ate with his hands, put all the used napkins in his pocket, and even took the straw and cup with his drink. For dessert, they ordered banana pudding, and Drew finally used a fork, but then wiped it with a damp napkin for 15 minutes, ruling out any possibility of obtaining a DNA sample from the utensil. Despite this, the investigators still took the fork and sent it to the laboratory. The experts were able to find tiny traces of DNA, which showed a partial match with the DNA of Stephanie's killer. However, the result was too imprecise, as more biological material was needed for a full comparison. In the end, the detectives obtained a warrant to search Drew's workplace. They hoped to find some item containing his DNA. The investigators were afraid that the man might escape if he found out about the search, so they decided to conduct it in the evening. Among the suspect's belongings, they found gloves that he had to wear when working with chemicals. The detectives understood that his DNA might be inside, so they took them and left another pair in their place. They still feared that Drew might try to run, so they kept him under surveillance for several days until the laboratory confirmed that the gloves did, in fact, contain his DNA. On October 18, 2005, police quietly surrounded the laboratory where a man worked and waited for him to come out. Investigators feared that if they tried to arrest him inside the building, he might take one of his colleagues hostage or attack them. Their concerns were not unfounded. When the man emerged from the building, he was immediately apprehended. He was found to have a loaded pistol on him and apparently knew that the police were just steps away from catching him and had no plans to surrender easily. During a 6-hour interrogation, the man, Drew, remained silent and refused food, water, and hardly moved. Eventually, detectives had to put him in a wheelchair to move him around the area. After obtaining a search warrant for his apartment, investigators found a laundry basket stolen from Stephanie's home. In addition, there were 9 pistols, 2 rifles, 40 knives, a sword, and a machete. Among his belongings, detectives also found a set of lockpicks and handcuffs. They found a notebook with dozens of women's names and immediately located them to ensure they were safe. One of the women was the same resident of his complex who had complained about Drew during the investigation. She said that he had been watching her on the street and she felt uncomfortable with his gaze. Her concerns were confirmed when police found her underwear and tampons in Drew's home, as well as a copy of her high school graduation tape. It turned out that Drew had broken into her apartment, taken the tape, made a copy, and returned the original. All this time, he kept these items even after moving. In his apartment, they also found a check in the name of a woman who was killed in 1999. Investigators learned that at the time, Drew lived in her city and, moreover, the woman was shot with a fairly rare caliber gun. But exactly such a weapon was found in the man's collection during the search. Thus, Drew became a suspect in this case. But first, he had to stand trial for the murder of Stephanie. A month after his arrest, the prosecution officially announced that they would seek the death penalty. The trial was supposed to begin the following year, and Drew spent that time in solitary confinement. but the trial never happened. On January 1st, 2006, a man was found dead in the same cell. Despite all precautions taken, he managed to end his life. Investigators had no doubt that Drew had killed Stephanie Bennett, but after a search of his house, the inevitable question arose: how many other victims could this person have had? At the very least, he was highly likely to have been responsible for the woman's murder in 1999, but detectives were practically certain that Drew could have been involved in other crimes. After carefully studying his biography, the police discovered several interesting facts. Drew grew up in a complete family with 3 brothers. Their father constantly humiliated and beat the children until the mother fled with them to another state. As a result, Drew became a very withdrawn teenager, and this only intensified in the future. Despite this, he received a good education and got a decent job as a chemist. His colleagues said he was very smart, but his social skills were practically non-existent. He had no friends, he didn't talk to anyone at work, and always tried to keep as far away from the team as possible. Interestingly, Drew's own brother also had a criminal record. He peeped at women with a hidden camera and received a suspended sentence. In 2008, Drew's mother sued the state government, accusing the authorities of causing her son's death. However, the judge concluded that the prison staff had taken all prescribed precautions and could not stop the man. Stephanie Bennett's father tried to sue the management of the residential complex for ignoring residents' reports of a peeping Tom and not paying enough attention to the safety of residents on the premises. In his opinion, there was not enough lighting around the building at night, and anyone could walk there unnoticed. He also learned that the window in his daughter's apartment had been broken, but the complex management did not rush to fix this problem, even though it was their direct responsibility. But in the end, the man himself refused these accusations, not commenting on his decision. Thus, this complex and confusing case was ultimately solved. Police to this day wonder how many other victims could Drew have had. The available information indicates that the man was prone to serial crimes, but after his death, it became practically impossible to find out the truth. Kate Waring was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. She had 2 brothers and loving parents who tried to give their children the best of everything. Kate demonstrated a love for animals from a young age and started volunteering at various shelters from her teenage years. She also danced, had many friends, and was a very positive person. It seemed to everyone that the woman grew up in a very good environment, and in part, that was the case. But one day, all of that changed. Shortly before going to college, she admitted to her parents that she had been abused as a child by someone close to her family. Apparently, she did not reveal his identity, as this information is nowhere to be found. For Kate's parents, this revelation came as a real shock. They hadn't had the slightest inkling of what their daughter had been through for years. After the woman shared this terrible secret, her mother and father tried in every way to help her, but the consequences of such a trauma over the years only worsened. First, Kate developed problems with alcohol and later with illegal substances. At one point, her parents suggested she get treatment, and the woman agreed. They also encouraged her to go back to their home and live with her family, which was also supposed to help her deal with her problems. At that point, Kate was an adult and living on her own, but she agreed to come home nonetheless. At first, it seemed like therapy was really having a positive effect, but Kate was still unable to let go of the heavy weight of the past and start living life to the fullest. The psychiatrist she went to diagnosed her with depression, but at one point, everything changed. Her father, who constantly supported his daughter and tried his best to help her, offered to take a trip anywhere in the world that Kate chooses. The woman was excited by the idea and soon decided she wanted to go beyond the Arctic Circle. Her dream was to see polar bears. Despite the sad experience, she still had a great love for animals. They set about looking for suitable tours and soon bought tickets. They were to get to the Arctic Circle by ship, and Kate couldn't wait for this exciting journey. At this point, her parents watched as her depressed state was replaced with a cheerful and positive attitude. When they finally went on the trip, Kate was over the moon. She and her father had a great time. The woman gained a lot of positive emotions. On the ship that took them to the Arctic Circle, Kate met another tourist from Russia. Throughout the trip, they communicated and continued to correspond at the end of it. Kate developed a liking for him, and sometime after his arrival home, she decided to go to Russia. There they met again, and the woman even considered staying in the country longer, but she was prevented by problems with her visa renewal, and Kate was forced to return home. In spite of this, it looked as if the woman had finally managed to overcome her depression. She planned to solve her visa problems back home and even began writing a book for her children. It seemed like her life was finally getting better. But on Saturday, June 12, 2009, everything changed. On that day, Kate was home alone while her family was away on business. The woman always called her father to tell him that she was okay, but not this time. Her father decided to call her himself, but Kate didn't pick up. After waiting a while, he asked his wife to come home and check on his daughter. Given her past problems with alcohol and illegal substances, her parents were still worried. When she arrived home, her mother didn't find Kate there. But here's what was strange. The light in her room was on. It looked as if the woman had gone out for a while and would be back soon. The mother waited a few hours, but Kate was still gone. She also discovered that her daughter had left important medications at home that needed to be taken regularly. Despite their concern, the parents decided not to panic and wait for their daughter to show up. After all, Kate was already 28 years old at the time, and her parents understood that she could live her life. The father made the decision to wait until Monday, after which he wanted to call the police. On Monday morning, the father received a call from the bank. An employee told him that a man had come into their office and tried to cash more than $4,000 in a check signed by Kate Waring. They could not reach the woman herself, and her father acted as a fiduciary on her account. The whole situation seemed extremely strange. The father knew for a fact that his daughter had only a few $100s in her account, and that was the reason the bank's security service decided to contact him. That said, the woman's own signature looked authentic. They also gave the name of the man who had brought this check. His name was Ethan Mack. The father did not know him, but because of what the bank said about Kate's signature, the real one assumed that this man was indeed an acquaintance of his daughter. Despite this, he still decided to go to the police because Kate was still not in contact. Detectives began investigating the man's disappearance, and the first thing they came up with were questions for Ethan. He stated that he had known Kate for years and that she had written him this check for her old debts. According to Ethan, he often gave her money for clothes, jewelry, and other purchases. After talking to Kate's acquaintances, the police did verify that she had been friends with Ethan for a long time. According to them, there had never been a romantic relationship between them, but they had always been close. Ethan himself said that he and Kate met Friday night and went out to eat at a restaurant. Afterward, he drove her home and left on his own business. He even showed the detectives correspondence with Kate confirming what he said about the dinner. Ethan allowed the detectives to inspect his home, where he lived with his mother and his car. They found nothing suspicious, but the situation with the check still seemed odd to the police, and they were in no hurry to clear him. Eventually, Ethan called the police station and, rather harshly, asked them to leave him alone. The police attempted to reconstruct the chronology of that Friday evening when Kate was last seen. She went to see her therapist in the afternoon, then went to the gym. Next, she went to the store and bought a bottle of wine. Surveillance cameras recorded her talking to someone on the phone at that moment. According to the investigation, she may have been talking to Ethan, who later picked her up, and they went to a restaurant. The woman's parents recalled another disturbing fact. On the day of her disappearance, Kate told them she was in trouble. She refused to specify what it was about, and her parents didn't remember it until a few days later. Alas, none of this helped in any way with the search. As the weeks passed, the woman remained unreachable. Her parents thought the police weren't doing enough from Kate's troubled past. In August, however, the case was given a new chance, and a group of former police officers, led by a lawyer named Andy Savage, took on the case. This group had been investigating cold cases privately, and Kate Waring's case interested them. In all, the group consisted of 5 men, each of whom had extensive law enforcement experience. One of them was former Detective James Randolph, who first examined Kate's bedroom. There, he singled out 2 suspicious things. First, his attention was drawn to a package of medication that the woman was taking on a regular basis. Her parents assured him that she would never skip a drug of her own volition, and the fact that she had left the package at home was really alarming. Second, he discovered Chinese money on Kate's bed. This was strange, for the parents had not the faintest idea where the woman had got it or why she needed it. Next, a team member named Bobby Minter got involved. He specialized in collecting information about a person on the internet and tracking people down. His skills really came in handy. In no time at all, he found out that on the day of her disappearance, around 10 p.m., Kate called her friend named James, but he didn't pick up the phone. Then the woman left him a very disturbing voice message. In it, she stated that someone had stolen her credit cards. He went on to find out that her phone was last active at 1:53 a.m. She called her own voicemail box number for some reason. Bobby found out that the call was made from the James Island area, which was a few miles from Kate's house. Another member of the team, former homicide detective Eugene Frazier, also found out something interesting. He talked to several acquaintances living in James Island and found out something strange. Ethan Mack, who had volunteered to let the police inspect his and his mother's house, did not actually live there. He was renting an apartment in a building nearby. Eugene was very fortunate to learn these details. The fact is that a close acquaintance of his turned out to be the owner of the very apartment Ethan had rented. Digging deeper, the team of detectives realized that the police did not conduct any proper investigation of Ethan. They only took a cursory look at his mother's house and let it go at that. The team decided to look into the matter on their own. They discovered that Ethan had a girlfriend named Heather Camp. When they asked Kate's parents if they knew the woman, her mother recalled a rather strange story. Kate had met Heather a month before she disappeared. They were on the same train from Washington, D.C., where the woman was dealing with problems with her visa to Russia. After meeting her on the train, Heather told her that her wallet had been stolen, and now she had absolutely nothing to live on. Kate agreed to help and loaned her a certain amount of money. Heather herself said she had gotten a job as a pediatric surgeon in South Carolina and should start in the next few days. A few days later, Heather stated that her daughter had been killed in a car accident in New Jersey, and here her behavior seemed completely illogical. Heather did not go there, and from her demeanor, it seemed that her daughter's death did not upset her much. The team of detectives discovered another curious fact. An Indiana fraud case had been filed against Heather. The reason for this was that she was posing as a licensed doctor, forging the necessary documents. Thus, the team gathered an impressive set of data that forced them to look at the case from a different angle. They turned all this information over to the police, but they were totally unwilling to investigate further. So the team realized their only chance to get the cops moving was to present them with unequivocal evidence implicating Ethan and Heather in Kate's disappearance. To achieve this goal, the team went to extreme measures. First, Eugene Frazier asked an acquaintance of his who rented Ethan's apartment to install a hidden camera in front of the door of his apartment. What's more, they installed a hidden GPS tracker on Ethan's car. This allowed the team to track his movements and see what he was up to. It wasn't long before it paid off. After studying Ethan's itinerary, the former detectives determined that he had been to multiple pawn shops throughout the city. They followed his footsteps and learned that at each of these pawn shops, the man sold various pieces of jewelry in small batches. Alas, they were unable to find out if the jewelry belonged to Kate, but the detectives felt they were getting close to a clue. After a while, they ran into a serious problem. The owner of the apartment where Ethan and Heather were staying informed them that he was going to evict them for non-payment. The team realized that if they did so, they would lose the ability to monitor their behavior and movements, so they made every effort to convince the owner not to do so. Along with this, the detectives urgently came up with a new plan. They asked the owner to give Ethan and Heather extra time to pay their rent, but on one condition. They both had to sign an agreement under which they would undertake to repay that debt in any case. This ruse worked. As soon as the landlord gave the team this contract, they immediately sent it to the lab. Their purpose was simple: to compare Ethan and Heather's handwriting with Kate's signature on the very check for $4,000, and here they had their long-awaited breakthrough. The specialist stated with absolute certainty that the signature on the check was written by the same person who had signed Heather on the contract. This meant that it was Heather who had forged Kate's signature. But the team was well aware that the lazy police still wouldn't want to listen to them. Something else had to be found, and they came up with a new plan. They convinced the landlord to play along and tell Ethan that the apartment needed to be treated for insects. The head of the team put on an exterminator suit and went to the apartment with the owner. Beforehand, the detectives waited until Ethan left the apartment. Noticing that his car had pulled away from the house, James and the owner went inside. An unpleasant surprise awaited them. Ethan was at home. It turned out that Heather was driving his car, but it was too late to call off the whole operation, so James had to change his plan as he went. They continued to stick to the legend of the need for disinfestation and asked Ethan to wait outside the apartment while the dangerous chemicals were sprayed. Ethan, who suspected nothing, agreed and went outside. At the same moment, James began to carefully search the apartment for any evidence that might link Ethan to Kate's disappearance. James noticed Ethan's backpack and examined its contents. There awaited his first clue: Chinese money. As we recall, the same bills were laying on Kate's bed. Alas, that wasn't the end of his luck. James was unable to find any other potential clues. He and the landlord pretended to do the processing and left. The team needed a plan again. As they studied the camera footage in front of Ethan's apartment, they noticed that one man came in very often. He turned out to be a neighbor of the couple named Terry Williams. The detective speculated that he might know about Ethan and Heather's involvement in Kate's disappearance. So the team took a risky step. They decided to offer Williams an impressive sum of cash if he would tell the police what his friends had done to Kate. They took the bag of cash and went to Williams' apartment with this offer. But here, the detectives had a rather unexpected twist waiting for them. At the time they knocked on Williams' door and told him about their offer, Heather was at his house and heard everything. Apparently, she was cheating on Ethan with Williams. After hearing the detectives talking to her lover, Heather panicked. She called Ethan and hysterically told her what had happened. The team didn't expect this scenario, and over the next few days, they tried to figure out what to do next. But then another surprise happened. Williams called them and invited them to his house for a talk. The detectives arrived at his apartment and Williams spoke. He stated that Ethan and Heather had not told him anything directly, but he suspected that the couple had done something bad to Kate. He then picked up an iPod from the shelf and revealed that Heather had given it to him just days after Kate disappeared, and Williams had assumed that the player belonged to her. The team examined the iPod, and thanks to the serial number, they were able to determine that it did belong to Kate. This set of clues was already enough to once again go to the Charleston Police Department And this time, the local cops could no longer shrug off their job. After examining everything the team had managed to dig up, they finally arrested Ethan and Heather. At the first interrogation, Heather agreed to cooperate with the investigation on the condition that the police help her get minimal punishment. She stated that Kate's body was on Wadmalaw Island, about 20 miles from her home. Police enlisted a search party and combed the area all day. But Kate's body was not there. It soon became clear that Heather had simply deceived them. Then, Andy Savage decided to resort to another ruse. He realized that Heather was most likely directly connected to Kate's murder, but he met with her and promised to help. Andy offered her a deal. He would do whatever it took to get her off the check forging charges, and she would name the exact location of Kate's body. Heather is convinced that this is her only chance, and she agrees. She said Kate's body is still on the outskirts of Wadmalaw Island, specifically near Polly Point Road. The woman also described a specific location. The team of detectives decided to go there without the police, and they were disappointed. They failed to find Kate, but they returned the next day, and it finally happened. The woman's remains were found. Medical examiners were unable to determine the cause of death, but soon the perpetrators themselves began to speak. In August 2009, Heather signed a confession to murder, obstruction of justice, and bank check fraud. Police discovered that the woman had been a scam artist for years, and on that train from Washington, D.C., she chose Kate as her next victim. She later met Ethan and began dating him. As for Ethan, he was in no hurry to plead guilty, and a trial began in October 2010. Based on testimony from Heather, the prosecution reconstructed the chronology of events. According to their version, on the day of her disappearance, Kate learned that Heather had cheated her and also stolen her credit cards. Kate threatened to tell her father, who would most likely involve the police. Heather told Ethan, who sided with her despite her long friendship with Kate. According to the investigation, Kate had dinner that night, not only with Ethan. Heather was also present. Apparently, the couple was trying to negotiate with Kate to keep the cheating story from escalating. At the restaurant, Heather might have promised Kate to return the credit cards and money that had been in Ethan's apartment. When all three got there, Heather and Ethan could have bided her time and attacked her. The court questioned Heather's version and ultimately sentenced her to 39 years in prison. As for Ethan, he was a little luckier. He was sentenced to 25 years. This difference is due to the fact that Heather was also charged with fraud. What do we have in the end? Because of the actions of one fraudster, events unfolded that could give rise to detective movies. On the one hand, we have Kate, who suffered a severe trauma as a child, affected by alcohol and other substances. She found the strength to change her life for the better and overcame her depression. On the other hand, we have a sad fact in front of us. Her whole life was cut short because of a combination of betrayal and lust for profit. Ethan Mack had been her close friend for years, and for the sake of his new lover, he took part in her murder. There are also the police, who did not do a quality investigation. After learning that the woman had a history of problems with illegal substances, they put the case on the back burner. This is where people who had useful skills and a desire to seek justice came to the rescue. A group of independents did more than the entire police department, and it was only thanks to them that the killers were sent to jail and Kate's family was lifted from their shoulders the heavy burden of ignorance. It is worth clarifying that not all of their methods are legal, but they did get to the truth. And what do you think? Are these mild violations justified? Angelica Hadsell was born on August 9, 1996, in the suburb of Norfolk, Virginia. Soon she had two younger sisters, but in 2005 her parents divorced and the young women stayed with their mother. In 2010 her mother remarried and they had another daughter. Thus, Angelica had three younger sisters with whom she got along well. Angelica graduated from a local high school and enrolled at Longwood University in Farmville, located about 3 hours from home. She joined 2 sports teams and planned to finish her studies a year early, which required her to work at an accelerated pace. Despite this, she regularly visited her family in Norfolk to see her parents and sisters. In March 2015, when Angelica was 18, she went home for spring break, planning to stay there for a few days. Angelica had a great time with her family, was in a great mood, and was happy to have the opportunity to live at home again. On the morning of March 2nd, her mother prepared her 3 younger daughters for school and then went to work, leaving Angelica alone at home. However, when her mother returned from work in the afternoon, Angelica was no longer there. Everything looked like she had left in a hurry. The back door was open, music was playing, and only some of her things were loaded into the washing machine. Her mother found this strange because she and her daughter constantly kept in touch, and Angelica was supposed to inform her if she was going somewhere. But that day, Angelica didn't answer her phone. Then her mother wrote to her and asked where she had gone. Angelica replied that she had gone for a walk with friends, but didn't specify where exactly and when she planned to return home. They exchanged several messages, and her mother noticed something strange again. According to her, the messages from her daughter were very different in style from what she was used to. Usually, Angelica wrote her detailed messages, telling her all the details, but this time she only received short and vague phrases. Despite this, her mother did not suspect anything bad, especially since her daughter was already 18 years old, and she thought that the young woman just wanted to spend time with her friends. On that day, Angelica never came home, but continued to respond to messages. However, she still did not give clear answers about where she was and when she planned to return home. In the second half of the day, the young woman stopped responding to her mother. Then she decided to call Angelica's friends and found out that none of them had seen her daughter and did not know where she was. By the evening of March 3rd, the mother decided to turn to the police. Detectives began an investigation, and at first glance, it seemed like the young woman had left on her own free will. Soon, this version was supported by a note found in the house. Angelica's mother claimed that it was probably written in her daughter's handwriting. There was only one sentence with a very strange content. Angelica wrote that due to everything that was happening, she needed time alone with herself. No one in her family could understand what she meant. The young woman was cheerful, spent all of her free time studying and making plans for the future. She never mentioned any serious problems in her life, so the note seemed meaningless. The police also found that Angelica left her clothes, wallet, and car at home. This already contradicted the version that she had gone somewhere of her own free will. However, at that time, there was no evidence to the contrary. The first lead appeared several days after the investigation. A neighbor named Cody, who lived near Angelica's family, found a piece of her credit card near his house. He reported this to the police and immediately became the main suspect. Detectives assumed that he could have some connection to her disappearance, so they questioned him for 12 hours. He denied his guilt, and yet the police did not rush to remove suspicion from him. Angelica's relatives also believed that he was hiding something. By that time, all residents of the area knew about this case, and many tried to help the investigation. People formed teams and searched the area for any evidence. They all began to suspect Cody after the credit card incident. Moreover, it turned out that he and Angelica attended the same school and dated for some time. Soon, another event occurred that indicated his involvement in her disappearance. Less than a week after the investigation began, Angelica's stepfather, Wesley Hadsell, burst into Cody's house and found Angelica's jacket there. The situation developed quite strangely. Wesley, who was involved in the search for his daughter with her friends, told them to go to Cody's house and look for Angelica's things, as he believed that the boy was involved in her disappearance. The friends did just that. They went to Cody's house and found her jacket there, which they immediately reported to the police. Cody was interrogated again, putting serious pressure on him. Despite this, Cody said that he had no idea where the jacket came from. All of this greatly confused the investigators. On the one hand, the jacket in Cody's house was a very serious piece of evidence. But on the other hand, during the interrogation, the detectives had a strong impression that the boy was telling them the truth. He was willing to voluntarily provide his DNA sample, undergo a polygraph test, and do whatever they asked. But most importantly, he provided an alibi for the day of Angelica's disappearance. The police checked this information and concluded that he could really be innocent. Then they talked to Angelica's friends who found the jacket, and they told them that Wesley, Angelica's stepfather, gave them the tip. With this information, the detectives allowed that the man could have planted the jacket. And here was the main question: why would he do that? The most obvious option was that Wesley was involved in his daughter's disappearance. The police began to study his biography and found that the man had more than 10 convictions for crimes of varying degrees of severity, and even more charges were not proven in court. He was repeatedly arrested for robbery, possession, and use of illegal substances, and in 2005, he kidnapped his own wife and subjected her to violence for several days. However, the court could not prove his guilt, so he did not receive any serious punishment. He had been in prison several times in his life, spending several years there in total. The detectives also found out that a few weeks before Angelica's disappearance, her mother kicked Wesley out of the house because he started using heavy illegal substances. Since then, he had been living in a hotel. All of this was enough to seriously consider him a suspect. During the interrogation, the man claimed that he had nothing to do with the disappearance of his daughter and was actively trying to find her. When asked when he last saw Angelica, Wesley stated that he saw her at a gas station around noon on the day of her disappearance. The young woman had asked him for a few $100s before they parted ways. However, the detectives reviewed the footage from the gas station cameras and found no evidence to support his claim. Wesley's colleagues at work reported that he had taken a few hours off on that day as his daughter had asked him for money. He returned to work at around 2 p.m. and was extremely nervous. There was an obvious contradiction in his statement. Wesley had told his colleagues that he needed to leave because his daughter had asked for money, but he told the police that he had accidentally spotted Angelica at the gas station while driving by. Furthermore, Angelica's car was parked near her home, so it was unclear why she would be at the gas station. When asked why he left work that day, Wesley stated that the alarm at the house where he lived before the quarrel with his wife had gone off, and he received a notification on his phone. The police could not verify this information, and it did not explain the obvious contradictions in his statement. The police then obtained a warrant to search Wesley's motel room, where he had been staying for the past few weeks. They found something interesting. Wesley had been keeping firearms and a large number of bullets. Since Wesley had several convictions, the law prohibited him from owning weapons, so he was immediately arrested. However, there was no evidence related to Angelica in his room. Thus, Wesley was charged with 3 crimes: illegal possession of a weapon, breaking into Cody's house, and tampering with evidence due to the jacket he had supposedly planted. He still insisted that he had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance and was doing everything he could to find her. As a result, the court sentenced him to 20 years in prison, and the detectives continued to search for the young woman. They confiscated Wesley's work vehicle and found a shovel, tape, and dark gloves inside. However, the most interesting item was the GPS navigator, which they sent to experts for analysis. The investigators wanted to know where Wesley had gone in the days after Angelica's disappearance. According to the data they received, on March 4th, Wesley had driven to a neighboring town 90 kilometers away from Norfolk. His car had stayed in one place for 20 minutes before he drove back to work. Having arrived at the location on April 9th, the detective saw that his car was parked near an abandoned house in a remote area. After searching the area, they eventually found Angelica's body in a ditch not far from the building. She was covered with a piece of plywood, but even without it, it would have been extremely difficult to find her by chance, as the area around the house was overgrown and inaccessible, so no one could have stumbled upon her. The body was sent for a medical examination, and an unexpected statement awaited all participants in the process. According to the results, a dose of prohibited substances was found in the young woman's blood, which was 3 times the lethal dose for an average person. Angelica's family was in shock. The young woman didn't even drink alcohol, was actively involved in sports, and devoted almost all her time to studying. No one could believe that she was taking prohibited substances. Medical experts decided to conduct additional tests by analyzing the hair. It is possible to determine whether a person has taken narcotic drugs in the past, and this analysis showed that Angelica had never dealt with prohibited substances before. This made the version that she suddenly took a triple dose of her own free will practically impossible. In addition, someone buried her body in the ditch and covered it with a piece of plywood. Everything indicated that the young woman could have been given these substances against her will, with the sole purpose of killing her and making it look like an accident. The detectives questioned Wesley again, who was already in prison at the time. The first question they asked him was what his work car was doing near the house where Angelica's body was found. The man's version was, to put it mildly, unconvincing. He said that he could have been set up and that he didn't go there himself. At the same time, he had previously said that no one except him had access to this car. Wesley even suggested that someone could have taken the Navigator from his car, driven to that house, and returned the gadget back. Meanwhile, the police collected footage from various street cameras located along the way to this house, and they did indeed manage to find several recordings that showed that on that same day, Wesley was in the city where his daughter's body was found, driving his work car. Despite all this pointing to the man's involvement in the murder, the court needed more evidence. Therefore, the police continued to work on this case for several more years, trying to find irrefutable evidence. As a result, Wesley was charged with the murder of Angelica only at the end of 2018. The main court hearings began in January 2022. According to the prosecution's version of events, on March 2nd, Wesley arrived at the house where Angelica was located with the sole purpose of kidnapping her for the purpose of committing violent acts. He took her out of the house, carried out his plan, and gave her a triple dose of prohibited substances because he initially planned to make it look like an accident. During countless interrogations, the police repeatedly found that the man carefully thought out his versions and tried in every way to divert suspicion from himself. The prosecution managed to find a witness who supported their version, a person who sold Wesley the same prohibited drugs that Angelica died from. The court also heard that the police found Angelica's phone on the street, and its location data was compared with Leslie's phone data. Since the young woman's disappearance, her smartphone was next to Wesley's smartphone, even when messages were sent from her mother's account. This indicated that it was Wesley who took Angelica's phone and tried to convince her mother that everything was okay with the young woman. The defendant's lawyers insisted that their client was innocent. According to their version, the young woman was depressed and decided to end her own life, and Wesley had nothing to do with it. This version did not explain why his car was near the place where her body was found, or who buried her, covering her with a piece of plywood. All these arguments tried to explain either coincidences or attempts to frame Wesley. Interestingly, the man had said many times before that he did not believe in the overdose version and believed that Angelica was murdered, but for some reason, his opinion changed in court. It took the jury less than an hour to reach a verdict. Wesley was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The man said he would appeal the verdict, and theoretically, he has a high enough chance of getting it overturned. As you may have already guessed, there is not a single material evidence against him. For example, no samples of his DNA were found on the victim's body, which would have been practically unquestionable evidence of guilt. The prosecution's main argument is the fact that Wesley's work car was actually located near the place where the young woman's body was later found. All other arguments are not serious evidence, although just this person's past alone makes any of his words questionable. Considering that 10 years before the incident, he also kidnapped his wife and subjected her to violence, the prosecution's version seems more than convincing. But due to the lack of more significant evidence, lawyers may well challenge this verdict and achieve a new hearing. Megan Sharpton was born on October 24, 1987, in the small American town of Tullahoma, Tennessee. She grew up in a large and friendly family with 2 sisters and a brother with whom she got along very well. Her parents tried to give maximum attention to all their children, but Megan was closest to her mother. From an early age, the young woman helped her parents take care of her younger siblings. She also always tried to help her friends and loved ones. In her school years, Megan decided she wanted to become a nurse, so she enrolled in the local Motlow College, which was 10 kilometers from her home. The young woman also got a job as a waitress in a local restaurant and eventually moved in with her boyfriend Chris. In the summer of 2012, when Megan was 24 years old, she had only a few months left before finishing college. After that, she planned to immediately find a job as a nurse. Shortly before this, she also got a job at a nursing home to gain practical skills in helping the elderly. Despite such an intense rhythm of life, Megan tried to see her family whenever possible. On July 1st, her sister, who lived in another city, came home and Megan promised to meet with her. However, that evening, the young woman called her mother and said that she would be delayed. She was offered an interesting job opportunity, and Megan agreed to an interview that same evening. She was happy for this opportunity and promised her mother to come as soon as the interview was over. According to her, the job involved taking care of an elderly woman. However, time passed and there was no news from Megan. She did not respond to messages or calls. Her parents began to worry. They contacted her boyfriend, but he also did not know where Megan was and was not even aware of the interview. Despite this, the parents decided not to panic and wait for their daughter to get in touch. She was already 24 years old, and with her busy schedule, between studying and 2 jobs, the young woman could simply be busy. But the next day, Megan still did not show up. Meanwhile, in a remote area several kilometers from the city, at around 1:30 a.m., a group of teenagers noticed a fire in a field. It was a hot summer, so they thought that the forest fires had spread to the grass. They immediately called the firefighters, who arrived at the scene. However, an unexpected turn of events awaited them. Soon after the firefighters began extinguishing the flames, they saw a body laying in the center of the fire. When the fire was completely extinguished and the police arrived at the scene, they realized that a dead young woman lay before them. They immediately understood that a murder had been committed. However, the detectives could not establish the identity of the deceased. She had no documents, wallet, or phone with her, and due to the fire's effects, she could not be identified. The only thing that the detectives could grasp was 2 small star-shaped tattoos. The detectives studied the crime scene and concluded that the young woman was already dead before the fire started. This was evidenced by a serious head injury, which apparently was fatal, but they could not find any traces of the killer's presence. The victim was partially undressed, but from her t-shirt, the police concluded that she worked as a nurse. They also determined that they had not received any reports of missing persons related to this young woman, which also complicated establishing her identity. However, soon after the information spread throughout the small town, her mother saw a post on social media about a young woman with 2 star-shaped tattoos being found in the field at night and realized with horror that her daughter was the victim. Medical experts ultimately confirmed that she was indeed Megan Sharpton. They also found that the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the back of the head, confirming the police version that the young woman was already dead at the time of the fire. Moreover, she was killed in another location and then taken to that field. In addition, she was subjected to violence before her death, and the experts were able to extract a DNA sample from the perpetrator. It was immediately run through the database, but there were no matches. First, the detectives began searching for Megan's car, a red Mustang. She had been working at a restaurant that evening and left in her car, but it was nowhere to be found. This indicated that the killer most likely drove it somewhere where they could find substantial evidence. However, its location remained unknown, and the police started searching for potential suspects among Megan's acquaintances. Their first focus was on her boyfriend, Chris, and the detectives had a significant reason to investigate him. Megan's sister immediately told them that she suspected Chris's involvement in the murder because there had been problems in their relationship. Megan had been dating Chris for 3 years, some of which they had lived together. They shared an apartment with another roommate, and the police spoke with Chris, who denied any involvement in the crime. At first, he claimed that everything was fine between him and Megan, but eventually admitted that their relationship had been struggling lately and they were heading for a breakup. He insisted, however, that he had no motive for the murder and had a solid alibi at the time of her death. While the police checked his alibi, they decided to search the apartment where Megan and Chris lived. In the bathroom, they found the first alarming clue: bloodstains and needles containing illegal substances. At the same time, 20 kilometers outside the city, detectives found her car. It had been abandoned in a remote, deserted location. Inside, there were no documents or phones, which meant that the perpetrator might have taken or thrown them away elsewhere. The police reached out to the public, asking people to report anything similar they might find. Additionally, there was no signs of struggle or blood in the car, but they found something interesting: a note with an address that didn't exist. The detectives concluded that the unknown criminal had used this address to lure Megan to a deserted place to commit the crime. From the first hours of the investigation, detectives learned that the evening of the crime, Megan was supposed to go for an interview, but they had absolutely no leads in that direction. They believed that the non-existent address was given to her by the person who offered her the job. When the public learned the details of the case, many drew a chilling parallel. 6 months ago, another young woman of roughly the same age as Megan, who was also studying to become a nurse, disappeared without a trace several hundred kilometers from Tullahoma. What was even more terrifying was that this coincidence led everyone to believe that a serial killer was at work in the area, fueling the atmosphere of fear that the perpetrator would strike again. Meanwhile, the police questioned the couple's neighbor, who admitted to taking illegal substances. The neighbor claimed that Megan and Chris did not know about this and never indulged in it themselves. Experts analyzed the bloodstains and concluded that they did indeed belong to the neighbor, but his story didn't end there. He claimed that Megan and Chris had actually broken up a long time ago, and he had started seeing her recently. The neighbor also insisted that he had been hiding his addiction from her. With this information, the police began to suspect both Chris and the neighbor. Chris could have held a grudge against Megan, and the neighbor had a penchant for illegal substances, but there was no evidence against them. During his interrogation, Chris stated that he didn't know about the relationship and by that time, the police had already verified his alibi. At the time of Megan's murder, he was indeed at work, so they ruled him out as a suspect. As for the neighbor, he didn't have a solid alibi, but analyzing his phone records revealed that he had been trying to call and message Megan all night in an attempt to find out where she had gone. Although this was not substantial evidence of his innocence, the police doubted that he was the killer. Both of the guys had their DNA samples taken and sent to the lab, but the results could take months to come back. Meanwhile, the detectives had a new lead. Chris had offered to help with the investigation during his last interrogation. On the day of Megan's disappearance, a man had called her old phone, which was at home, and said he wanted to talk to her about a caregiver job, and that Naomi had recommended her. Chris added that Megan had mentioned a young woman with that name who went to college with her, but he didn't know any details. So the police started looking for her among Motlow students and soon found her. She was the only student with that name, and the detectives got her address, but she wasn't home. They talked to her neighbors, and one of them gave them Naomi's phone number. She was surprised by the police call and said she barely knew Megan. They had a few classes together but didn't talk much, and she never recommended her for a job. In fact, she added that Megan annoyed her, so she wouldn't have helped her. The police were disappointed that this promising lead didn't lead anywhere, but they still had something more substantial. Chris gave them the phone on which the job call had come in, and the detectives had the caller's number. Experts determined that the call was made from a prepaid phone, so it was impossible to identify the owner's name. But the police traced the device to the store where it was sold, and there was a surveillance camera at the checkout. By studying the footage on the day of the phone purchase, they immediately saw the buyer. From these shots, the police immediately realized that he was buying the phone for some illegal purposes. Prepaid phones in America are in demand among those involved in criminal cases, as they do not need to provide their data to use them. And this person on the recording at some point took out his own phone from his pocket, indicating that he was buying an additional one for some questionable purposes. There was also a camera in the store pointing at the parking lot. The police saw the buyer leave the building and get into his car, which soon led to the identification of his identity. It turned out to be Timothy Gifford, who had an impressive criminal history. However, the man only engaged in petty trade of illegal substances and was not involved in anything serious. He was soon tracked down and taken to the police station. He claimed that he had purchased the phone not for himself, but for his acquaintance, a 37-year-old man named Donnie Jones. He said that Donnie was going to have an operation and he himself would not be able to go for the phone. As payment for this service, Donnie gave Timothy several illegal pills. Detectives were familiar with this man. He also had an impressive criminal history, but often acted as a police informant. Despite this, no connection between Donnie and Megan was traced until Timothy revealed something else. Donnie wrote to him that he wanted to exchange his pickup truck for a Mustang and asked for help with this. Timothy considered this request quite strange, as Donnie had 2 small children and the Mustang was far from the most convenient family car. However, he agreed to try to find a client. Donnie handed him the pickup truck and he noticed that there was brand new carpets and seat covers in the interior of the rather old car. Donnie explained this by saying that his wife had told him that the chances of selling the car with a refreshed interior were much higher. And here, the police suddenly discovered something that shocked them and glued all these parts of the store together. Donnie Frank turned out to be the husband of Naomi, who supposedly recommended the job to Megan. At this point, the detectives realized that they were getting close to solving the case. Unfortunately for them, the man's DNA sample was not in the database, as he had not been charged with violent crimes. They immediately went to Donnie and Naomi's house to talk to them. At first, the man claimed that he was not familiar with Megan, but within a few minutes he said that he had given her and Naomi a ride to college a few times. This seems strange against the backdrop of Naomi's testimony a few weeks earlier. Then she claimed that she barely knew Megan and they hardly spoke and did not get along in general. However, during the subsequent conversation, the woman did say that her husband had indeed given them a ride once. However, Donnie firmly insisted on his innocence. According to his words, on the evening of the murder, he was at home with his children. He allowed the police to search his house without a warrant and voluntarily provided his DNA sample. In addition, he denied asking Timothy to buy a prepaid phone for him. The police found no evidence in his house, and they had to wait for the DNA test results, which could also take months. 2 months had passed since the murder. Megan's parents received her nursing degree, and the event was dedicated to her memory. People hoped that the police would catch the ruthless monster who could kill someone else at any moment. Eventually, the lab results showed a complete match between Donnie's DNA sample and the one found in Megan's body. He was immediately brought to the station, but he continued to insist on his innocence. Upon learning of the DNA match, he changed his story and told the detectives that he had a secret affair with Megan, which he did not tell his wife about. This was supposedly the reason why he did not reveal this information initially. The police considered his story an obvious fabrication, but they had to release him. Besides DNA, they had no other connecting evidence, and finding 100% refutation of Donnie's words was simply impossible. Thus, the detectives were almost certain that Donnie was the killer, but they needed more evidence. Although they could not charge him with murder, they still managed to arrest him. During a search of his car, they found a firearm that he was not allowed to possess due to his criminal record. While he was in custody, the police had time to search for additional evidence. They did not have to worry about Donnie attacking someone else or running away. Soon, experts determined that Megan was shot with a firearm of the same caliber as Donnie's rifle. Detectives obtained a warrant to track his phone to see his movements on the evening of Megan's murder. They compared this data with the movements of the prepaid phone that Donnie allegedly never owned, and here the police waited for a long-awaited breakthrough. On the evening of July 1st, the prepaid phone was next to Donnie's phone and was moving along the same route. Detectives identified several key locations: Megan's presumed abduction site, the location where she was killed, and the field where her body was found. Both phones were found together at all these points. Donnie's family owned several farms in the Tullahoma area, and according to the investigation, he brought Megan to one of them after kidnapping her, where he assaulted and killed her. Detectives obtained a search warrant and found a significant piece of evidence: a partially burned scarf that belonged to Megan, which was a gift from her sister. This evidence, combined with Megan's belongings and DNA found at the scene, was sufficient to send the case to trial. On November 5th, Donnie was charged with murder. During the trial, new details emerged that only strengthened the case against Donnie. Experts examined his phone and discovered that he had repeatedly contacted other young women, offering them jobs as caretakers for elderly people. But all of these attempts were unsuccessful. According to the investigation, Donnie found Megan's phone number on his wife's contact list, contacted her, and said that Naomi had recommended her for the caretaking job. She agreed, and he gave her a fake address, luring her to a remote location. There, he attacked her, took her to the farm, where he assaulted and killed her. He then took her body to a field and set it on fire. The final touch was a complete replacement of the floor mats and seat covers in his pickup truck, which he used to transport her body. Apparently, he was afraid that some bloodstains might be difficult to clean and the police would be able to detect them. As for Naomi, the police concluded that she had nothing to do with the murder and had no knowledge of it. She was at work that night, which was confirmed by numerous pieces of evidence. During the trial, Donnie claimed his innocence and everyone was preparing for a potentially lengthy process. However, when he realized that the prosecution was seeking the death penalty, he decided to make a deal with the investigation. He would admit guilt in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Megan and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, he later claimed that he had only made the deal under pressure and demanded a retrial. When the judge granted his request, Mann quickly returned to his original decision to plead guilty, as the death penalty was back on the table during the retrial. During the court proceedings, it was also explained why the criminal voluntarily provided detectives with his DNA sample without any doubt. Apparently, he hoped that the fire would destroy all traces and the police would simply have nothing to compare a sample to. But he was wrong. Despite this, investigators concluded that Donnie was highly unlikely to be involved in the disappearance of another student who disappeared 6 months before Megan. More suitable suspects appeared in that case, and Donnie's candidacy was no longer considered. After the verdict was announced, Megan's sister stated that the criminal would have continued to hunt young women and could have taken many more lives, but Megan stopped him with her own life. And finally, what makes this story even sadder is that in November 2013, Megan's mother, who had been doing everything in her power to help the police catch her daughter's killer, passed away. She could not cope with the devastating trauma inflicted on her by one cold-blooded criminal. Looking at Donnie's biography, it becomes clear that he could have been stopped much earlier. Among his many convictions was the charge of kidnapping a young woman, but that time he managed to escape punishment, and the criminal remained free. Who knows? Maybe Megan wasn't his first victim, but the police still don't know about it. Johnia Brandon was born on March 13, 1966, in Salt Lake City, USA. She was a cheerful and energetic woman, a member of the school cheerleading team, and had many friends. After completing her education, Johnia worked for some time in her home state, but at the age of 29, she decided to move to Las Vegas. She liked the vibrant pace of the city, which offered many more opportunities to earn money. After moving, Johnia worked as a cosmetic salesperson in several elite firms, but in 2001, she decided to become a waitress at the Palms Casino. At that time, the establishment had just opened, but it quickly became one of the most popular casinos in Vegas. It was at this job that Johnia met her future husband, George. He often visited the casino, and a romance quickly developed between them. A year after they met, the couple had a daughter, Madison. A few years later, they officially got married. It seemed that this family had a happy and carefree future ahead of them. George worked as a firefighter, paid a lot of attention to his wife and daughter, and always took care of them. Johnia worked at the casino, earning quite decent money there, but in 2008, their relationship began to deteriorate. Due to the financial crisis, George lost a considerable portion of his savings, which were invested in real estate. On this basis, he became nervous and irritable, increasingly venting his anger on his wife and daughter. Eventually, the woman decided that they should live separately for some time and moved into her own apartment. The couple went to a family psychologist, but no improvements were observed in their relationship, and they increasingly discussed divorce. Another blow to Johnia was that her apartment was robbed. While she was at work, several valuable items were taken from her home, including her engagement ring. But a strange separate detail was that the thief also took her panties, leaving men's underwear in the apartment. The woman reported the incident to the police, but they could not identify the perpetrator. On the morning of September 29, 2012, 3 weeks after the incident, George picked up his daughter from her grandmother and went to Shauna's apartment to retrieve some of the girl's belongings. They continued to share custody of their daughter, and she was supposed to spend a few days with him. As they approached the apartment, they saw that the garage door was open. When they entered the apartment, they were met with a gruesome sight. Shauna was lying on the floor, blood everywhere. Her 8-year-old daughter witnessed a horrific scene. George immediately called the police and reported what had happened. The 911 operator asked them to go outside with the woman and wait for the officers. Investigators began to study the crime scene and determined that Shauna was likely attacked near the stairs on the second floor of the apartment. The house was in complete chaos. Many things were scattered and broken, indicating a struggle between the victim and the perpetrator. Medical experts found serious injuries on Shauna's body and initially thought that her death may have been caused by a gunshot wound. However, they soon realized that all these injuries were inflicted by a heavy, blunt object, most likely a hammer. After interviewing neighbors, the police received 2 leads between 3:30 and 4 a.m. One of the residents in the same building heard some noise from the woman's apartment. He didn't pay much attention to it because he knew that Shauna was coming home from work at that time. Another neighbor found her phone, documents, and cosmetics on a nearby street, which indicated that the perpetrator either intentionally threw them away while fleeing the apartment or accidentally dropped them. Investigators reconstructed the timeline of events that night. On surveillance cameras at the casino and its parking lot, they saw Shauna finishing her shift and leaving for the parking lot. Nothing on the footage indicated that the woman was alarmed or in any danger. Detectives concluded that the killer was likely already in her apartment when she returned home. As usual, the first suspicion fell on her husband, George. The police have already found out that the couple was getting ready for a divorce. They also talked to Shauna's friends and learned about the problems in their relationship. Everything looked as if he really fit the role of the killer. However, the detective found that the man had an unquestionable alibi for that night. He was on a 12-hour shift at the fire department. This was confirmed by all his colleagues and camera recordings. Thus, the police did not have any serious clues. They immediately learned that the woman's apartment was robbed 3 weeks earlier and tried to understand if there was any connection between these events. The version was being developed that the robber might have returned, but did not have time to leave the house before Shauna arrived. A struggle broke out between them, and he killed her. Meanwhile, the victim's sister continued to suspect George in what had happened. She was constantly talking to Shauna and knew about all the problems in their relationship, about his constant jealousy and scandals. However, his alibi was unquestionable. Therefore, the police focused on searching for other clues. A day after the discovery of the body, they received the first serious lead. By that time, the killer was being talked about in all the local news, which drew the attention of Vegas residents. A man who knew a homeless person called Greyhound turned to the police. He told this witness that he killed the woman with a hammer. According to the man, Greyhound talked about it with joy and even laughed. Given that the details of the murder were not disclosed in the media, this lead became key for the detectives. They found out that the witness lived in a tent on the outskirts of the city and often met with Greyhound near the Albertsons store. Together with him, they went there and started waiting. Very soon, the witness saw him and reported to the police, who immediately approached the suspect. During the search, they found banned substances on him, which allowed them to arrest Greyhound. In the police station, the officers found out that his real name was Noel Stevens. He had been repeatedly convicted of petty thefts and possession of various substances. but the man denied his involvement in the murder, and the investigators really doubted his candidacy as a suspect. First, he only committed minor offenses, and it was difficult to imagine why this homeless person would kill someone. Secondly, he lived practically at the other end of the city, which made the choice of the victim completely incomprehensible. It took him several hours to get to Johnia's house, while many really valuable things in her apartment were untouched, including cash. None of this made any sense. However, the police continued to investigate his involvement. They found a tent where Stevens lived and conducted a search. The tent was located outside the city in a remote desert area. While examining the area around it, investigators found several significant pieces of evidence. Just a few meters away, they discovered the suspect's pants and underwear covered in blood, as well as a hammer tag. Later, experts determined that the blood belonged to Johnia TFA. However, the main clue was waiting for them at the police station. By gaining access to Noel's smartphone, they found only one contact in his notebook: George TFA's number. At this point, the case took an unexpected turn. From conversation with Johnia's friends and relatives, investigators learned that George had been friends with a homeless man for several years, whom he entrusted with various household and yard work. The woman often complained about him to her acquaintances when he came to fix something. According to her, he behaved strangely and even creepily, but George never took her concerns seriously. Thus, detectives found the missing link between the killer and the victim. But the main question remained whether George had any involvement in this, or if Stevens chose the woman as a victim simply because he knew Johnia and her work schedule. With the help of the hammer tag, the police found out when and where the hammer, which was most likely the murder weapon, was purchased. By requesting surveillance camera footage, they were shocked to see Stevens and George TFA walking into the store and buying the same hammer. At this point, investigators realized that Johnia's husband could indeed be the mastermind behind this horrific murder. When all this evidence was presented to Stevens, he finally decided to confess to what he had done. The man admitted that he did indeed kill Johnia, but only on the orders of her husband. According to Stevens, George paid him $600 for it. They had been planning this crime for several months. The man bought dark clothes for Stevens and gave him a duplicate of the keys to her apartment. 3 weeks before the murder, he asked the homeless man to break into her house and stage a robbery so that later the police would be confused and conduct their investigation along that line. On the night of the murder, Stevens snuck into her apartment again and waited for the woman to come home. After she arrived and began to walk up to the second floor, he came out of his hiding place and attacked her. Stevens said he struck her about 17 times, causing the hammer to break. The killer agreed to show detectives the location near a campsite where he buried his weapon. With Stevens' confession and a multitude of evidence, the police charged George. His relatives were shocked because he had always been a caring and loving family man who helped people. Upon learning of the accusations, George's sister called him and told him that he was suspected of murder. Immediately after the call, he got into his pickup truck and tried to leave town. However, at the exit, the man crashed into a fence and flew off the road. The police who arrived at the scene concluded that he deliberately caused the accident in an attempt to take his own life, and there were no tire marks on the path of the car. George did not even try to brake, but only pressed on the gas pedal. However, he did not succeed in his goal. With medium injuries, the man was taken to the local hospital. 2 days later, the police informed him that he was arrested for murder. George's reaction was very calm. He asked to contact his lawyer and also to allow him to take a shower and brush his teeth. From that moment on, the police department began preparing to transfer the case to court. 3 months later, Noel Stevens agreed to make a full confession in exchange for a waiver of the death penalty. George TFA refused to admit his guilt, and the trial against him only began 3 years later in August 2015. At the hearings, he did not utter a word, entrusting all the work to his lawyer. His relatives acted as witnesses and spoke about how George could never have done such a thing to his wife and could not be involved in her murder. His defense was based on the fact that Stevens killed Shauna on his own initiative, and her husband knew nothing about it. According to the lawyer, the store camera footage did not prove anything. It only showed how George and Noel were buying tools that the latter needed for housework. The prosecution did not believe in such a scenario. In court, they presented a printout of George's phone calls, according to which the man called Stevens 87 times in September 2012, 5 of which were made shortly before the murder. Based on Stevens' testimony, the prosecution concluded that money was the motive for the murder. George lost a significant portion of his savings due to the crisis, resulting in Shauna becoming the main breadwinner in the family. She earned over $100,000 a year, while George's income was only half that amount. He realized that in the event of a divorce or property division, he would be left with nothing, so he decided to get rid of his wife. Stevens initially didn't believe him when he spoke about the murder. Prior to this, they had been friends for several years, and Noel had actually done various work around the house and property for a small fee. In the end, George offered him $5,000 to kill his wife, and he agreed. According to his testimony, the man planned to get this money from an insurance company after Shauna's death. Despite Stevens revealing all the details of the murder and how he and George planned the crime, there were certain difficulties during the trial. The results of Stevens' medical examination were presented during the hearing, which showed that the man often suffered from visual and auditory hallucinations and regularly took potent banned substances. He did not deny either of these points, so all of his words were questioned by the defense lawyer. Because of this, neither side was sure of the outcome when the jurors began to deliberate. It took them 3 days. In the end, George TFA was found guilty of conspiring to commit murder. When the judge pronounced these words, George showed no emotion. He was sentenced to life in prison with an additional 81 years for the remaining charges, including conspiracy to break into a home and robbery. Soon after the verdict, George filed a 107-page appeal in which he confessed to the crime in the third person. He wrote that prescription drugs had clouded his mind, causing him to be unable to distinguish between good and evil. All of this led him to believe that killing his wife would be the only way to protect their child. George revealed that he had suffered a serious injury several years before the murder, but the court did not appoint a psychological examination for him. Despite this, in 2017, the court rejected his appeal because there was no reason to doubt that his mental state prevented him from clearly understanding what was happening. Since George's arrest, their daughter has been living with her maternal grandmother and has been actively helped by her sister Shauna. At one point, this girl lost both of her parents and learned what a monster her father was. He deliberately took her to the apartment, knowing in advance what she would see. Obviously, he did this to provide a more reliable alibi without caring about the consequences for his child's mental health. As for Stevens, he received a 42-year prison sentence. Considering that this man spent most of his life on the streets, it would be foolish to consider such a sentence as punishment. Leslie McCrae was born on April 14, 1968, in Jacksonville, Florida. She was kind-hearted, determined, outgoing, loved to have fun, had a sharp mind, and a great sense of humor. Leslie grew up in a loving family, but was particularly close to her 4-year younger cousin Joey. Despite living in different cities, the girls tried to spend as much time together as possible. Leslie even considered moving to her city when she turned 18. After graduating from high school at the age of 17, Leslie enrolled at the University of North Florida, dreaming of building a career in the modeling industry. She moved out of her parents' house and into an apartment complex with her 21-year-old boyfriend, Edgar McQuarrie. On the night of December 24, 1985, they were sleeping in their apartment when Edgar woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise. To his horror, he saw a man with a knife above their bed. The unknown criminal tied Edgar's hands and feet with ties, threatening him with a weapon to prevent him from resisting. He then tied up Leslie in the same way and took her out through the back door of the apartment. Edgar, still tied up, could only watch in horror as the kidnapper took Leslie away. It took him 3 hours to free his hands, and around 6 a.m., he called the police. Detectives arrived at their apartment, took Edgar's statement, and began searching for Leslie. Considering that the room was almost pitch black at the time of the abduction, Edgar could not see the perpetrator's face or any other distinguishing features except for brown hair. The police also did not know what kind of vehicle the kidnapper had used, although it was evident that he had used some form of transportation to abduct Leslie. While detectives were trying to find witnesses and examining the street, they received a call at their station. 3 hours after the kidnapping, a man went out for a morning run and noticed a female body lying in a ditch next to the road, 8 kilometers away from Leslie's apartment. The investigators arrived at the scene and immediately identified the young woman. Her body was covered in various injuries. Some of her clothing was torn or missing. Medical experts determined that the young woman had received more than 20 sharp object wounds, and there were also many bruises on her body. In addition, the killer had subjected the victim to violence, and experts were able to extract his biological material. Considering that DNA analysis was not yet used in those years, this evidence could not help the police identify a suspect. There were no other useful clues at the scene, so the investigators decided to focus on examining the victim's apartment. Soon, they had serious doubts about what had happened that night. According to the victim's boyfriend, the criminal had quietly entered the apartment, but no signs of a break-in were found, and there were no signs of a struggle in the rooms. In addition, the back door through which Leslie was allegedly taken out was covered in cobwebs, and no fingerprints were found on it. There were no shoe prints, despite a thick layer of dust around it. All of this suggested that the boyfriend's story may have been fabricated, and in that case, an obvious question arose. Does he have anything to do with the murder? However, this version had its nuances. The investigators doubted that the boyfriend could have taken out and killed his girlfriend, then returned to the apartment and called the police. Experts suggested that her body was dumped on the street after Edgar called 911, so he was no longer considered a suspect. Over the next few months, the detectives tried to find new leads, but each time they hit a dead end. As a result, the investigation was finally suspended in 1986. The criminal's biological material, which was the only serious evidence in this case, could not help the investigators at that time, and they hoped that in the future, this clue would lead them to the killer. For many years, this case sat gathering dust in archives, but Leslie's relatives never lost hope of finding the culprit. They reached out to various authorities and gathered information themselves that could be useful in solving the case. However, their resources were limited, so they were unable to find any new leads. In 2010, Leslie's mother, Sarah Adams, was diagnosed with a serious nervous system disease that practically robbed her of her ability to speak. Despite this, she continued to maintain contact with investigators through notes. After that, Leslie's cousin Joey became the most active in the search for the truth. Although she and her family lived 2 hours away from Jacksonville, she regularly traveled there to speak with investigators or help Leslie's mother. However, attempts to reach out to the police practically led nowhere. Detectives were not eager to reopen the investigation, considering the lack of new evidence. Additionally, they were occupied with ongoing criminal cases, so they were in no rush to take on a decades-old murder case. As a result, Joey began to accuse the detectives of being negligent in the early stages of the investigation, or even covering up the perpetrator. She even suggested that the killer may have bribed investigators, but she had no evidence to support this theory. Joey also regularly gave interviews to local news channels, trying to draw public attention to the case. She recalled the time spent with her older sister and described Leslie as a cheerful and positive person. She also regretted that her 2 children never got to know what a wonderful aunt Leslie could have been to them. In late 2018, her relatives' persistent efforts produced the first results. They contacted representatives of the Cold Case Files project, and they became interested in Leslie's case. This nonprofit organization, which began in 2015, focuses on unsolved murders in which police have been unable to find the perpetrators. The organization collects and disseminates information, engages in dialogue with investigators and the media. In addition, they provide support to the victims' relatives, advising them on communication with the police and journalists. The organization's employees posted information about Leslie's murder on various resources, trying to attract as much attention as possible to the case. In such cases, when investigators have not been able to solve the case, public interest can play a key role. Firstly, the more people hear about this crime, the more chances there are that potential witnesses to the event will be among them. Sometimes people, without realizing it, may have seen or heard something that could lead the police to the killer. Secondly, under pressure from the public and the media, the chances of detectives reopening the investigation increased. Throughout this time, they have the perpetrator's biological material, but to study it, they needed to reopen the case, which police officers often do not do due to a lack of personnel or funding. The organization worked together with Leslie's relatives for several months, and they really managed to draw attention to this case. They wrote in the news and talked about it in reports, and in June 2019, representatives of a popular local TV channel contacted the family. They offered to record a large-scale interview in which relatives could talk about Leslie and their years-long attempts to seek the truth. Her cousin and mother accepted the offer and met with journalists. They told them about who Leslie was as a person, showed her photos, and were dismayed by the fact that the police had not been investigating the case for over 30 years. In addition, in the interview, relatives mentioned they believed that the boys Leslie mentioned were her killers, and in their opinion, her story about a man with a knife was not trustworthy. The boy himself could have killed her, but the journalists decided to cut this moment out, as Edgar was not a suspect in this case and there was no evidence against him. Representatives of the TV channel contacted the sheriff's office, hoping to get some additional information, but the police refused to comment. They referred to rules that prohibited them from discussing with journalists cases that were not currently under investigation. Leslie's family was disappointed with this outcome, but they were not going to give up. Joey continued to write letters to investigators demanding that the case be reopened, and ultimately it paid off. The family was able to organize a meeting with law enforcement representatives, and detectives indicated their intention to revive the investigation. The Leslie family was interviewing again, and the police began to re-examine the evidence. In April 2020, they sent biological material from the victim's body to a laboratory, and soon experts extracted a DNA profile, which was entered into the FBI's national database and immediately received a match. Almost 35 years later, the investigators finally had a possible killer's name. He was 58-year-old David Nelson Austin. After studying his biography, the detectives found many interesting moments. His DNA was in the FBI database not just by chance. Since 1991, the man had been serving a sentence for 2 sexual crimes committed in 1988 and 1990. At that time, he lived in Michigan, where he moved from Florida. Detectives determined that at the time of Leslie's death, he was living in Jacksonville and was 24 years old. 2 months before the murder, he attacked a mentally disabled young woman and attempted to assault her, but he failed. The man was arrested, but the justice system treated his act very lightly. Austin received no serious punishment and remained free. In addition to this, he had a whole series of less serious crimes, including drug possession, disturbing the peace, and more. Detectives had no doubt that he was behind Leslie's murder and began preparing the case for trial. Gathering all the necessary materials, in early 2021, they went to the Michigan prison to interrogate Austin for the first time. The man denied his involvement, but no one was going to believe him on his word. Investigators took his DNA sample to directly compare it with the biological material found on the victim's body. This had to be done as part of the standard procedure, and the result was expected: a complete match. In August 2021, Austin was officially charged with the murder of Leslie. Since then, detectives have been working to have him transferred from Michigan to Florida, where the crime was committed. The need for transfer was due to one simple fact: Florida had the death penalty, unlike Michigan, and Austin could have received that sentence for the murder of Leslie. The process took a year, until September 2022, when he was finally transferred to a correctional facility in Florida. He is currently behind bars, awaiting trial, and investigators have no doubt about his guilt. The only way for the perpetrator to avoid the death penalty is to make a deal with the prosecution and confess to the murder in exchange for another life sentence. During a press conference, investigators admitted that Austin was never a suspect in the case and was never questioned. According to them, the man did not leave any clues that the police could use to pursue him, and DNA analysis was impossible at that time. Furthermore, his DNA was only added to the FBI database in 1991, 6 years after the murder. Joey also gave an interview in which she said that she had always believed that Leslie's boyfriend was the killer. It was only after investigators revealed the real perpetrator's name that she realized that Edgar was also a victim in this story. It is expected that she will be the main witness in the trial. Leslie's mother said she forgave her daughter's killer, which surprised her family members, but they all respected her decision. Interestingly, Austin has a son named Owen, whom he has never met. Nevertheless, they regularly communicated via email. Journalists contacted Owen and learned that he was shocked by the charges against his father. Austin himself wrote to him about it, adding that he had nothing to do with this crime. At the same time, his son was well aware of other criminal episodes from his father's life, but continued to communicate with him. Austin's trial is expected to begin soon. If there are no bureaucratic delays, he may receive his sentence in a few months. Despite the fact that the truth has finally come out, the victim's relatives still blame investigators for negligence, believing that if they had periodically reopened this case, the perpetrator's identity could have been established in the early 90s rather than 30 years later.